Okay, so welcome to everybody. Folks can hear me okay? Yes, okay, thanks for the nods. Welcome to this evening's meeting of the Norfolk Advisory Committee. Let me confirm the Advisory Committee members who are here. When I call your name, please respond in the affirmative. Kristen Balish.
Here.
Brian Bichkowski.
Here.
Michael Huff.
Here.
Jonathan Hurwitz.
Here.
Jackie Katz.
Here.
Susan Klein.
Here.
Our clerk, David Lutz. Are you muted there, Dave?
Here, sorry.
That's okay. And Kiara Moore.
Here.
Wow, we are all here tonight. And I am the chair of the advisory committee, Arthur Franzak. We also have some staff with us tonight that I just want to have as record on attendance. We have our town administrator, Blythe Robinson.
Here.
And we have Todd Lindmark, our town finance director.
Here.
Excellent. Are there any other staff members that I'm missing? Okay. And presenting tonight, we have Dr. Alardi, who I believe is here.
Hi, I'm here. I'm not sure that I wasn't aware that we were being asked to present, but I'm happy to answer any questions the advisory board might have.
No, that's fine. Okay, very good. And then Paul Zinni from King Philip.
Here with the same understanding as Dr. Alardi.
I like your shirt there, Paul. Very nice. Got some King Philip green going on. Okay, excellent. I also want to remind people that we're conducting this meeting per the recent changes to the open meeting law. We're doing this online. We have posted all the agenda materials on the wonderful website URL norfolk.ma.us. I always forget the new URL. And we are being recorded, so please be aware. Everything is being recorded for history, posterity, and so forth. Having said that, our agenda tonight involves us talking to Blythe about the budget discussion. And then after that, we're going to review the warrant. We did get a citizen's petition in just, I think it was the day before yesterday, Susan Jacobson, correct?
It actually came in a bit ago, but it was revised, and that came in to the town administrator's office yesterday. So it didn't give me, I didn't know that it was what day it was going to arrive, so it just didn't provide us with enough time.
Right, we have to post it a week in advance anyway, right? So we're going to talk about that next at our next meeting.
Yes, I just also wanted to mention, Arthur, that Kevin Calcutt's joining us as well.
Hello, Kevin. Okay, outstanding. So Blythe, with that being said, I believe that our guests from the schools will be responding to questions as opposed to presenting, which is totally fine. Blythe, do you want to walk us through where we are at in terms of the budget deliberations, discussions, and approvals?
Yes, of course.
Thank you.
So since the last budget that was approved was an increase for FY21 of 2.43%. And after that, the select board had asked us to do some more work to look at what we thought what impacts there might be to state aid and local receipts, and how we might consider adjusting the budget further to be prepared for those possibilities. So Todd and I began some modeling. We're immediately joined by Ingrid Alardi and Todd Hassett, who's her business manager, to look at not only what's happening in Norfolk, but what our communities like us and near us doing, and what advice do we have from the state. And with all that, we came up with a total amount of reductions that we thought were responsible, perhaps conservative, to prepare Norfolk for the likelihood that we would see reductions of some kind coming from the state and to our own, the line items that we have within our budget. That cut totals $983,063, and it represents about a 10.8% reduction in a combination of local receipts and state aid. We gave the select board a presentation at their May 5th meeting, which detailed which accounts those would come from. It was a combination on the local receipts side of restaurant receipts and building permits and excise tax and assumption of no receipt of prison mitigation funds. And on the state receipts, it was a combination of Chapter 90 and lottery aid, or as also called unrestricted government aid. So we presented that at the meeting on the 5th. The select board voted 2-1 to accept that change. And then our next order of business was to determine how those reductions would be made. So since the meeting on the 5th, we had another meeting, both with, we included Ingrid and Todd, as well as Paul Zinni and Larry from KP, to try to determine what would be an equitable way to make those reductions. And so the reductions go as follows. First, we still are very confident that the grant to the regional dispatch facility will be forthcoming. And that would mean we'll not need to budget those funds overall for the whole year. So it goes from $380,000 to 0. We would probably keep at least a quarter of that in the budget for now, just to make sure that if the grant paperwork is a few days past the first of the fiscal year, we can make a first quarter payment if we need to. But we would not plan to spend the rest. That makes up, like I said, $380,000 of the reduction. And the rest of the reduction is about $602,000. What we did was try to model what would be a proportional share between town and schools, recognizing the overall budget as it is once you back out the fixed costs. We also were having conversations with our sister communities in KP to understand what they were doing. And the end result was we came up with a share of all the reductions, and they would go as follows. The town side of the budget would reduce just under $205,000. Norfolk schools would be a reduction of just under $285,000. And the reduction in Norfolk's budget for KP would be just under $113,000. And we understand that both Rentham and Plainville are planning to budget their corresponding amounts so that the overall budget increase to KP would be 2.5% for FY21 in this budget instead of the 3.49 that the school committee had originally certified. So at this point, I know that Ingrid and Paul are here to answer your questions about what impacts they see to their budgets and what it means. But I want to say that going forward, none of us are particularly excited about this at all. We know what it means to service delivery and meeting our requirements with our unions for compensation. But what I've learned through this, especially, is that it's very important. It's critical for schools to be able to be prepared no later than the beginning of August to set up all their classes and teachers and what's happening for students. And so it was our collective belief that we'd rather make these reductions now and be able to restore them in the fall when we have the data from the state. We have a better handle on local receipts. Is to go with a higher budget now and then potentially have to make much deeper cuts in the later part of the year. If the overall budget reduction is about 3%, we may be able to achieve that with union discussions and other changes that will be not as deep to overall service delivery as they would be if we waited till be able to affect those, say, the beginning of January. Then I'm absolutely confident there'd be layoffs in all sectors. So I'll leave it there. I know I've gone over a lot. I hope it's been clear, and happy to answer your question or dialogue about this.
Thank you for the overview of the approach. I know a lot of people are giving this a lot of thought, which is greatly appreciated. I will now turn it over for first questions from the advisory committee. After we've had a couple rounds of those, I will also then open it up to folks from the general public who have joined us. Just a couple notes about the question and answer format. I think we're trying to get better at this each time that we do it. Online is new for many of us. So when you are in your Zoom application, at the bottom typically, or the top or someplace, there's a participants button. If you click on the participants button, you'll get a list that comes up. There should be a raise your hand button at the bottom of that. So if you would like to ask a question, please indicate so by raising your hand. When you do raise your hand, please have 1 to 2 questions in mind. This is something new I'm going to try here. People, I think in the past, have had concerns that if I select them to speak, that might be their only chance at the microphone. So sometimes we end up with 3, 4, 5, a whole list of questions. To me, that's not as helpful because it's confusing. I know if I'm presenting and somebody asks me 5 things at a time, I usually remember one or 2. So if you just ask a question, we'll get that answered. I'll ask if you have a follow-up question, we can get that answered. I will then move on to the next person. If you'd like to ask more questions, you could raise your hand again. Zoom does a pretty good job of making a queue for me to follow. So that's how I like to do it. Please have a question and a follow-up question after that. Appreciate it if people be additive, meaning that if something hasn't brought up several times before, I don't think we need to go over that again. And that's really it. So I hope that that's clear to people. My goal is to have a good discussion where ideas are expressed and then responded to. Having said that, the honor of the first question goes to Kristen Balish. Kristen, yes.
I'll save my school questions. I have 2 quick questions for Blythe. The first is the initial budget was 2.43% increase from prior year. With this reduction, what is the new increase or decrease from the prior year?
It's an increase of 0.13%.
Thank you. My second question is, I haven't looked at all kind of the towns around us, but is this like 10.8% state aid and local receipt reduction pretty similar to other towns? The only one I kind of noticed more recently was Millis. And Millis had considered either a 5% reduction in state and local or 10%, and they went with 5. So I'm just curious, how similar are we in the choice of going with closer to a 10 or 11% reduction in state and local aid?
I'm going to say that that there are more towns than not that are in a similar vein, even ones that, a month or so ago had been saying, we're going to stay the course, we'll just wait till the fall, have started to make turns in our direction. I think the deepest number I've heard mentioned is a 20% reduction, but I haven't seen anybody planning that yet. And I'm hedging my answer a little bit because as soon as I think I've learned something, I hear about a few more towns that have changed their mind and doing something different. I think the hardest part of all of this is that there isn't any clear direction from the state, and I understand what they're dealing with, so they haven't dealt with it yet. It just makes all this so much harder.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. David Lutz, yes, your question, please.
I guess it's sort of a follow-up to Kristen's, but I heard in the presentation at the very end when you were discussing the schools, you said 2.5% increase or decrease. I didn't quite get what you said. What was that? You said a 2.5% something.
The budget that was certified by KP was an increase year over year of 3.49%. So if each of the towns makes its corresponding cut to Norfolk's 113,000, their overall budget increase would go down to a 2.49%. But I can see Paul in the Hollywood Stars box next to you. I'm sure that he can clarify for me if I've got it wrong.
Thank you. Can I ask Paul if that's correct?
That is correct. Our increase would go from the requested 3.49% to an increase of 2.5%. Remind you that the 3.49% was a level service budget, so it would be 1% under level service at this point.
Understood. Thank you.
Did you have a follow-up question, David?
That was my follow-up. Thank you.
Very good. Hollywood Squares, my goodness, is that still out? Is that still?
No.
Oh, Susan Klein, yes, please, your first question.
Okay. So I'm not sure if anyone has been following the select board meetings, and but I have made it very clear that I do not support this cut. I think it's way too aggressive, and I think it will, if you look at the type of cut they're talking about making, and will make it extremely difficult to recover from this, simply because we have enough trouble getting a level service plan. To get back to where we were now for next year, you'd have to have level service plan plus 2%. I don't think anyone's going to go for that, which means we're going to be climbing back out of these cuts for a very, very long time. With that said, I understand the position that they're in. I have spoken in depth with Blythe and with Todd, as well as with Ingrid Ilardi, about what the right solution is. And I understand that because we don't know where everything is going to go, they need to be prepared. But I would just like to caution the board on approving such a drastic cut. My one question before, now that I said that, my question is to Blythe. As we discussed, I had hoped that the select board, by cutting our school budgets, our fire budget, our police budget, and our DPW budget, would also be willing to revisit the retiree health insurance benefits that they put down. Or passed over, I should say. I shouldn't say put down. I apologize for that. And they did not. And I find it very hypocritical and disturbing that they would like to cut current town employees' benefits and pay. We're asking both sets of teachers to renegotiate their contracts. We're talking about laying off current teachers, but we don't want to affect, retiree health insurance benefits, which we are allowed by the state to do. I would like to discuss at some point, Arthur, when you're ready for it, to not restore the 2.4 budget. I understand that cuts need to be made, but I would like to consider, after my meeting with Todd, a 1.3 to 1.5, which would include the 2.4 budget cut down with the MEC money cut out of it, as well as the retiree health insurance benefits cut out of it, but it wouldn't make any further cuts to our police department, our schools, and our DPW and our fire, to our town. So that's where
Understood. Now, was there a specific question that you had?
Just to Blythe about, does she have any information on why they did not revisit that, and what the process would be to get them to, and it, instead of cutting 983,000, at the very least, once you take off the 400,000 for the MEC and an additional 121,000 for the retiree health insurance, that at that point, at least the cut would be minimal. It would be, correct me if I'm wrong, Todd, I think we discussed it would be in the 500,000 to 600,000 range versus the 983,000 range. I don't even want that, but I would at least feel better about that. If we're asking our teachers to take pay cuts, we should also be addressing the retiree health benefits.
Oh, thank you. Blythe, can you respond?
So the action would be for the select board to put it back on the agenda and to discuss it again and see if there's any consensus to vote it, to increase it by some amount. The other thing I would need to check in with Todd's office is, I think letters have already gone out for July, so I'm not sure we could affect it for a July 1 start. It might have to start a little bit later in the year. So the 120,000 represented a change from paying 65% of retirees health, 50%. So if we had to do it for a little bit less of the year, we just have to do the math and figure out what that would be worth.
Okay, so does that, first, what I'd also like to just point out is in moderating this, we're talking about budgets which impact, students' it impacts the entire town. It impacts employees and services. So, I mean, I understand that the stakes are very high, and we're also very, very passionate about this. I would ask that people try to refrain from characterizations of motives. I think saying something's inconsistent, okay. I would like to avoid characterizations like hypocrisy or hypocritical if possible. Again, I get the intent, but again, if we could just stick to perhaps language which is has fewer implications, I would appreciate that.
My apologies. I will rephrase, and I will say that it is not taking that word out, and I will say that it is not satisfactory that they are making those cuts without considering other cuts that don't affect current town employees at this point.
Appreciate that. That's a perfectly legitimate position, and we can definitely talk about alternatives should the board choose to submit, should our committee choose to submit something on its own. So I do very much appreciate the thought of the idea behind that. Okay, thank you for those questions. Brian Bichkowski, please, your question, sir.
Thanks. My question goes to the recovery plan once we have more information. So I understand it is easier for us to add budget back in. So we want to underestimate where we think we're going to be and be able to come back up. But also understand that there is a risk of cutting too far and then having it be difficult to recover in the year as well. I would just like opinions on, the relative risk of a 0.1 versus a 1.5 growth, and being able to use that as a point of departure for the fall discussion, both in terms of ability to recover if it goes higher or lower than expected, and in terms of flexibility to adjust from that point.
Do you have specific thoughts on that, Blythe, or perhaps one of our school representatives can speak to what they're comfortable with and the boundaries and how much or how little?
I think it's important if all of us do speak on this. We haven't gotten together to talk about exactly how restorations would be made, because all of these funds all go into what's called the general fund, and those fund all of the town and school activities, even though some come from a specific state grant or a specific program. So we haven't had any conversations yet about, well, if Chapter 70 comes in, does that go directly to schools? And if prison mitigation comes in, is that all to the town or is it shared? I'm very proud of the fact that we've all worked together in figuring this out so all of us, all town services are kind of share all of this somewhat equally, and it's not targeted to any one group. So I'd want to give the same level of thought to how we figure this back out to restore it. Knowing that, for instance, excise tax revenue, which is car taxes, those bills don't go out till February. So we're not necessarily going to know the whole picture by the time we're supposed to set the tax rate in the fall. Unfortunately, none of this is straightforward or simple. But I'll leave it at that and suggest perhaps Ingrid or Paul want to weigh in on this.
Well, I can say from King Philip's perspective, the problem with adding money back in afterwards is that it's a 3-town decision, or it's not easily added back in. The initial cut that Blythe was describing, moving from a 3.49 to a 2.5%, we've had a conversation with the 3 communities, with all 3 town administrators, and that's the amount that all 3 towns at this point are looking to support. If we were to see a better revenue source and there was money to add back in from Norfolk, we would need corresponding votes from Rentham and Plainville as well to move things back to King Philip. So it becomes much trickier to bring money back into the district once that happens.
Follow-up comments or questions about that, Brian? Does that answer your question?
No, thanks. That's I'm not sure it answers directly, but it sounds like it's difficult on the KP side for sure, and probably a complicated answer on the town side as well.
And I can just jump in from the elementary perspective. You know, as Blythe mentioned, we're looking at about $285,000 of reduction in order to help balance the requested budget from the select board. It is challenging, obviously, as Paul mentioned. We really had proposed a level service budget, so we have to make difficult decisions in terms of where to reduce. We are doing everything possible to protect classroom teaching positions and programs. We're eliminating things like any summer custodial help that we would have hired, so we're looking at everything. At the same time, if you were to vote a higher budget, the numbers that we're hearing from the state, I think the 10% was the original estimate. We're actually hearing it may be even lower than that in the shortfall. So I think it's a conservative approach, but realistic. So what we would have to do is, regardless if you vote the higher budget with the intent of making cuts in the fall, we are going to have to make those same cuts regardless. We would have to leave those positions unfilled. Because if we fill them and are asked to make cuts in the fall, then we have to actually cut more deeply, because we then have to cover unemployment costs. We're also making a cut later in the year. So if I have to save $60,000 and I'm starting it in November, that's more than one position at that point. So the approach that we would be taking is to prepare for this $285,000 cut regardless, and fill those positions if funding is available, or if income comes in higher in the fall. Either way, I think it's the best way for us to protect the district and to prevent having to make cuts that go deeper, that would be even harder to bring back.
I agree completely with Dr. Lottie, and if I could also add, for us, because especially at the high school level, students choose their individual classes. For us to make class adjustments after the school year starts is virtually impossible. You can't say to a student one term into the year that we can no longer offer AP biology, and so pick another science. We have to know what the staffing looks like before the school year starts. And in fact, we have to design a schedule that accommodates 1,300 students' choices. So we really have to have those schedules ready for the first day of school. So we're making decisions regarding staffing in classes that are running and not running no later than August 1st to have those schedules ready. So we would have to move forward with whatever assumptions. If there was money restored to King Philip afterwards, it could be restored in other areas such as professional development, technology, areas like that. But whatever staffing we start the school year with is what we need to continue the school year with. And if I may, for one more thing to point out, as we're talking about state aid and we're talking about the concerns that arise from that, I do think it's important to point out that King Philip is its own municipality. And so if state aid is cut, that would be a direct cut that King Philip would feel as well. So in addition to whatever the communities are looking to support or can't support us on, if the state aid is cut and we're hearing things like 10 or 20% at this point, that would be dramatic to King Philip directly. A 10% cut in state aid for us would equal something like $830,000. So just putting those variables out there for us to just be thinking about.
So just to, if I could just clarify this one point before we go on to the next question, because this is pretty key from my perspective. We don't really have good choices at this point in time. And as difficult as it is to restore money to a budget once it's been preemptively cut, the alternative scenario of facing deeper cuts with less discretion later is even worse. So you guys very much want option A.
We do, and if I could just add on to what Ingrid said, I, like Ingrid, would plan to make reductions now. We're going to be sitting down formally with our unions next week. We've already had informal conversations about, how they could help us partner through this, and at the very least try to forego pay raises till we have the clear picture. I would much rather be in a situation of possibly restoring or just staying where we are than having to make twice as hard a cut and definitely laying people off. later in the year. So
if I could just jump in on that, Blythe, I think part of the intent of the questions I've heard so far is to say, I hear what you're saying, Blythe. Are you aware how difficult it is to put money back when you're saying that, though?
Oh, I am. And,
okay. I suspect the answer is yes, but I just would like you to address that point specifically. That
yes,
okay, so,
absolutely.
Okay,
thank you.
Could I add one other comment?
Yes, go ahead.
So the one thing that I would say is that we did ask, and the select board did discuss the other night, if the revenue came back or came in higher than anticipated, or if additional state aid or funding was available, that money be restored at a special fall town meeting to the budgets. And as Blythe said earlier, there wasn't a firm decision about how that would be restored, but my hope would be that the advisory board and the select board would support that funding be allocated proportionally to the cuts that departments were asked to make. So at this point, with the shortfall of 600,000, the vast majority of those reductions are coming from the schools. Between King Philip and the Norfolk Public Schools, that's over 400,000 of the 600,000 shortfall. So if prison mitigation money came in, which we're not counting on, or if state aid came in higher, I would hope that that funding would be appropriated to the line items of the school budgets and other departments in proportion to the cuts that each department was asked to make.
Understood. Thank you for that point. Moving on, Kiara, yes, please, your question.
Thanks. I had a question, I guess, more on the process. So we've heard some pretty detailed budgets from the school and from other folks at this point. Since we're revisiting, would we hear those new proposed budget cuts in more detail, or is this kind of the level of discussion that we're going to get?
Anyone to respond to that?
So I can tell you on the town side, our strategy is to work with our unions and try to gain concessions so that if we can do that across all of our town departments and non-union, unionized employees and non-union, we will be able to cover the 205,000. The only things that we're not, so we haven't nailed that down exactly. That's our first plan. But having said that, we also need to keep in mind that what's happening for the schools, if Ingrid needs to make some reductions and lay staff off, the unemployment and benefit costs are on the town side. So we need to keep working together to understand that so we can adjust as well and make some other adjustments to account for that. So I think that's as specific as I can be right now. If we had to lay people off, we're going to look at positions that might be vacant. We do have right now, and where we could pare back. Probably all but fire department, because the town accepted a federal grant in the fall to hire 2 new positions. If we were to, and the agreement for that was that we had to keep those positions for 3 years. There's significant downsides to foregoing those and laying those people off that the town would likely feel for a long time to come. So we'd be very hesitant to do that. So,
do we see any relief from those requirements associated with those grants to hire, given the circumstances?
No, we've checked in with them since COVID, and our sister community in Rentham is in the same situation. They actually hired 6 firefighters with that grant.
Oh my goodness, 6.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Did you have a follow-up question, Kiara, or does that?
I can speak to the school process.
Okay.
So we've already had public hearings for both King Philip and the Norfolk schools on our budget, and our school committees voted to approve the budget as it stands at the 2.54 total town increase. If a lower number is then voted at town meeting, then our school committee would have to revote a budget and make those reductions after town meeting. The committee's priorities have always been to protect classroom teaching positions and programs. So we're doing everything possible to find other ways to make reductions. One thing that I would say, and I'm sure Paul's in the same boat, we're going to hold on finalizing some of those until we have a better sense of what school reopening is going to look like. If we're required to remain partially in a remote learning platform, there might be different budget decisions we make regarding positions than if we're coming back in a partial reopening and have additional transportation or sanitization costs. We might have to make other adjustments. So we will not be presenting again to advisory board. We presented the school committee approved budget as it stands. If a lower number is then approved at town meeting, then it would go back to the school committee, and those again are open public meetings. So if anyone's interested to follow that discussion from there, that would be the process to do it.
Thank you, Dr. Lardy. I see both Todd's hand up as well as Blythe. Did you guys have some clarifications you wanted to make on this point? Todd, Lindmark, Blythe?
Yeah, so I just wanted to kind of circle back. Kristen asked a question earlier regarding comparables. At the select board meeting, we did a presentation on the reduction of the 983,000 and how we came up with that number. Basically, we had reached out to a couple of listservs, both for finance directors, as well as town administrators, town managers, to get some feedback of what are other towns doing given what's happening in the economy. We got 22 responses back. A lot of them indicated that they're going to be moving forward with their current proposed budget, and they'll make adjustments at the fall town meetings. Some of the standouts or the numbers that we were able to put together from the data that I at least received, about 37% of the communities are not making changes to state aid. About 9% are level funding the state aid, meaning the amount they used last year is what they're going to be using this year. And then 55% or so are making reductions to their state aid, and those range anywhere from 2 to about 10%. And the average with the numbers that I received was about 4.2% overall. Local receipts, again, 41% of the communities not making any changes to their local receipts. 9% are making changes, keeping it as level funded. And about 50% are making some changes. And again, ranges from level funding to about a 12% reduction in their local receipts. And the reductions on the local receipts would include, we talked about motor vehicle excise tax earlier. For us, it would be meals tax, interest, things of that sort. So we went through some of the line items for the revenues and identified, first, obviously, we have the MEC, which would be 385.64, which would help offset that 983 total. And then we identified in the local receipts approximately, in summary, about a $615,000 reduction in state aid. The monies that we received from state aid, about $368,000. Local receipts drops about 14% in total, state aid 7.4. Overall reduction between the two is close to 11% reduction. And then we identified again a listing of the local receipts, motor vehicles, what the differences are and so forth. Again, works out to be about $615,000 that we're taking from there, and the balance of the 368, which is the 983 that we're looking at as far as a reduction. But I just wanted to give you the comparables that we were using to come up with our analysis to say, okay, what makes sense? What's reasonable? What are other people doing given what's going on? Because when you don't know a lot of factors, how much is the state going to cut? How much is the Fed going to reimburse? We have some positive things for us that are going forward. The state MEMA program has identified Norfolk has earmarked about $1,056,000 that we can use to offset some of the expenses that are COVID related. That would include the 25% differential that we wouldn't get from FEMA. And again, FEMA has specific expense requirements. So those that would be eligible for FEMA reimbursement, we would be getting 75% reimbursed from FEMA. We'd also apply through the state through this program, and we potentially get 25% reimbursed for that. So some of the expenses that we've had for this year and going into next year that are identified as COVID related could be reimbursed from those funds. And I think Massachusetts, $2.6 billion allocated from the FEMA program. So there's a sizable amount of money to be utilized there. I'm not saying that we're not going to be able to get everything, because again, it's all eligible expenses. And hopefully FEMA's pretty quick. Sometimes they take a little bit of a lag time, but from what I'm reading and hearing from other programs, we have to apply for this first round by June 5th, which will get us some monies coming back for this year. Hopefully it goes to free cash to make us a little bit better position. And then also we'll be applying because the expenses, we can submit expenses all the way through December 30th of next year, which again, whether we have to pay for twice as many buses, plexiglass on all the doors, sanitation, overtime, what have you, at least we have something that we can have as a little bit of a help should we need it. It's not the end all be all, but it is positive news for us. So I just wanted to kind of give you that little bit of an update. I'm sure Blythe probably has tons more to talk about as well.
Thank you, Todd. I believe Ingrid also wanted to share some perspective. She had typed some information into the chat about additional reductions.
Oh, I was just,
Dr. Lardy?
Sure. I was just going to mention that when we worked, Todd and Lynn Mark and Todd Hassett worked together and did a great job reaching out to 35 districts and gathering comparable data. On the regional we participated in the other day, it does appear that some towns that originally were planning to move forward with the assumption of state aid as at a level funding have now since made reductions since that time. So just in the last few weeks. So I just wanted to add that.
Okay, all important data which are being made to you or being made to help support some of the decisions that I know people are making in budget forecasting. Was there anything you wanted to add to that, Blythe, or can I go on to the next question?
Just to say that I'm glad that Todd covered the FEMA and the CARES Act, because I think that will help us end this fiscal year with more positive free cash, because those monies that we've been spending on COVID ought to be recovered. And then, you know, I know I've been anxious about what it means for school in the fall. And so the thought that those costs will be covered as well will hopefully help us navigate any further state reductions if they happen. So.
Okay, thank you. And there are many hands up. I'm working to get to all of you. Jonathan, you've been very patient. Yes, please, your question.
Sure. I apologize if I missed this at the beginning. I guess it's just an allocation type of question. So for the overall 983K reduction, I'm just wondering, what's the allocation of that on a percentage basis to the town, to town schools, and then to KP?
So the way we approach that, Jonathan, and I'll let Todd jump in with these statistics because I know he's got them at the ready. We first backed out the money for the MEC, the 380,000, took that out first. Then we set aside the fixed costs that we have in the budget, insurances and snow and ice and those sorts of things, pension obligations, back that out. And then we proportionately shared the rest of the budget split between town and school. So it worked out to about 200,000 for town and 400,000 for school, as Ingrid noted. And then we further discussed the school amount and split that share between KP and Norfolk schools. The exact percentages, I'm sure, as I said, Todd's got. So.
Okay, and a follow-up question, Jonathan?
Yeah, well, I'm curious in just understanding the allocation of that 983 number across those three, but I'd also be interested in understanding what's the way to phrase it? I guess the relationship to the percentage reduction allocated to each category against the percentage of the overall budget for each of those categories, right? So for example, if Norfolk schools get, making up a number, whatever it is, 40% of our budget, what allocation of a reduction are they getting? If they're 40% of our budget, are they getting 40% of the reduction? If KP's 30% of the budget, are they getting 30%? Now, I realize those aren't the numbers, but I just kind of want to see it in that context to try and get a sense of how these are either proportionally or disproportionately spread out across those three categories.
Is that something that you can speak to here, or you'd like to get back to us on? Todd, I see he has his hand up.
I'm ready.
Go, Todd, go.
All right, so it breaks out 20.8% to town. 38.7 is the MEC. 40.45 is the schools broken out. 11.47 for KP, 28.97 for Norfolk.
Those are the allocations of
Percentage. The 983.
Okay.
If I could add to that, I mean, part of this conversation, it's not completely straightforward math, because in talking about how to fairly handle schools and KP, we also needed to engage our sister communities, understand what they could and were willing to do, and try to have consensus for the, you know, to be able to support their school as well.
No,
So
I can appreciate that. And the regional schools, it certainly gets a lot more complicated. Just if, and I'm rounding numbers, but if 44% of our reduction was allocated towards the schools category, 40% is allocated towards the schools. What's the back of the napkin math on what percentage of our overall budget goes towards the schools?
So the way we did the allocation, the way we did the math, we came up with a revenue number reduction, which is the state aid and local aid percentage reduction. That gave us the 983. From the 983, we subtracted the MEC out to leave us a balance of 602,499. That 602,499, then we divvied it up based on the discretionary costs of the town and the schools. And it worked out to be about a third for the town and 66% or whatever for the schools. And then based on the conversations with KP and Norfolk, we got the breakout for the schools, KP being 112,828 or 11.47% of that number. And then KP is 28.97. That's the rationale that we used.
Todd,
Okay.
can I jump in
Yes.
on that?
Yes, Ingrid, please go ahead.
So I believe that when we looked at the, to Jonathan's questions about the proportion of reductions, you took the MEC money off the top and then proportioned the reductions consistent with the proportion of spending to each department. Is that correct? Because schools took about 66%, and I think we're about 6% of the total town budget. Is that correct?
For the discretionary portion, correct. Yep.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And again, I see some folks from the general public have their hands up. I do want to get to you. There's a few more advisory committee members' questions that I'd like to resolve first, and then I will open it up to public questions very soon. Mr. Lutz, yes, David, go ahead.
So my question has evolved since I raised my hand, but Paul had mentioned that when they would look at costs to the budget that they presented to us, that classroom, commitments to class stuff would be hard to cut, and they would be looking to other areas like technology and things like that. In one of Ingrid's responses, she mentioned that the budget as presented was what they had and they wouldn't go back and look at it. I guess my question is, are either the KP system or the Norfolk Public School system planning on, are you looking at things that you would present to a committee after town meeting? Because if you're looking at cutting, if you're gonna, is there a way to present what you might present to the school committee? I understand you can't act on their behalf, but I mean, we have another, from my understanding of last night's meeting, we have another 6 weeks before town meeting is going to occur. Is there, if there's information that can be brought to town meeting on what that would mean, it would be worthwhile finding out at town meeting or before town meeting.
I can respond.
Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. I can certainly respond to that. We are aggressively looking at all of the different options that we would potentially have, and we'll be discussing those at school committee meetings between now and then. Where we're delayed a little bit is that we are not expecting at this point direction from the governor's office or from the Mass Department of Public Education regarding what school reopening in the fall can look like until June 30th. So it's after town meeting, and there may be decisions, different budget decisions we would make based on reopening. So for example, if we are remaining remote learning, I might be able to reduce my bus contract because I'm not transferring kids.
Right.
So what we're doing right now is looking at all the different possible options we have with prioritizing, protecting programs and teachers. And then once we know what the fall reopening will look like and have a better sense of those costs, we'll make budget decisions according to that in the best interest of students and staff. And we will get those out, but we're held by the timeline as to when the governor is going to announce and Department of Ed will announce what we're able to do for fall reopening.
Thank you.
I think that sums it very well.
Paul? Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
Paul, go ahead. Go ahead, Paul.
I was going to say, I think that sums that very well, what Dr. Arlotti said. You know, she mentioned the reduction in costs or changes, you know, maybe her buses would go down. I'm as worried, if not more worried, and I'm sure Dr. Arlotti is as well, that when we hear the requirements that the governor puts forth regarding how we begin to reopen schools, that there are going to be significant increased costs that we can't even begin to fathom right now. For example, we normally put 2 to 3 students in a seat on a bus. And so if we are busing students and we are told that they have to have some level of distance and it's only 1 student per seat or 1 student on every other seat, you can imagine what the bus costs could escalate into. And so there are all kinds of things like that, that as Dr. Arlotti said, that we just, there are so many moving parts to this. It's hard to even begin to explain the confusion that we have right now. But I will say that our admin team sat down about 2 weeks ago and looked at each and every department and where we would make recommendations for first cuts if we had to cut the budget, you know. And again, we've got some ideas out there. As Dr. Arlotti said, we're going to do our very best to try to preserve staff and try to make sure that our students don't know that cuts were made. That said, the deeper the cuts, the harder that's going to be to do.
Mm-hmm. Thank
Understood.
you.
Thank you. Brian, yes, Mr. Bichkowski.
Thanks. The question I had is actually on not the state aid side, but last week, or I guess last time we talked, there was a statement around the property tax is usually pretty solid in that it comes in eventually, but there may be a delay. With our requirement to meet fiscal expenditures with available resources on a given fiscal year, is there any concern around potential delay of property tax receipts impacting the budget beyond where the state aid is?
Who would like to respond?
I'll start, and since the collector works for Todd, I think he should jump in as well. But overall, our collection rate in Norfolk is very strong. It's in the high 90s, you know, year over year. And even Todd had run some numbers with me that I don't have in front of me now, but in the last recession, the didn't really drop off significantly, and the state law is set up in such a way that, you know, eventually the town's going to receive its money. It's going to receive it with interest and penalties. So I'm not overly concerned about that. We might see a delay, but I think people overall it will be, you know, consistent. Todd, you want to add to that?
Yeah, we with a lot of the changes and things that were going on, they allowed us to extend the payment date from May 1st to June 1st, which we've done. Even doing that, we didn't have an expectation that we'd have a large drop off, which we're not experiencing. We don't have people calling in asking for a lot of payment plans or anything like that, but a lot of communities are experiencing. Norfolk's just a little bit of a different type situation, and thankfully, knock on wood, things are progressing good and in the right direction that we anticipate that hopefully they continue. 2008, 2009, different time. It was obviously the housing crisis. Obviously, we're a little bit different crisis. Unemployment numbers, we checked for March. We actually had 10 less claimants this year than we did last year for March. We expect April to probably go up a little bit, but being at 2.9% for the community, given what's going on and hearing all the bad numbers about unemployment, Norfolk, again, is a little bit resistant to follow suit with a lot of other communities. So I don't have really any huge hesitations to say collections will be pretty much on track. There may be a little delay on a small amount, but for the most part, 50% of all of our tax payments are received via mortgage companies processing. The other 50%, 45 of them are paid online and or through checks. So again, we're not seeing any crisis there at the moment. Knock on wood.
Thank you, Todd. Does that answer your question, Brian? And Brian, I also applaud your excellent decision to broadcast from the gazebo in front of Town Square there. That's very, very classy. Very classy.
It's remarkably light out still.
Yeah, it's.
I would like to ask Larry who let him into the 600 Club.
It's all who you know.
Yeah, out there at Fenway Park. Okay, two more questions.
I'm the only one here.
Two more questions here, then I'll open it up for some public questions. Kristen, yes, go ahead, Kristen Polish.
Thanks, everyone. So I know that this is my first go around doing budgeting on the advisory board. So Susan had mentioned what my understanding is, which is that this body can either choose to recommend that we go forward with the 0.13% increase or propose an alternative. This is kind of a question, I guess, for Blythe and Dr. Ilardi and anyone else who'd be affected by this, I guess. But if this group were to propose an alternate budget, is that something you would welcome, or does it add more complexity to your plate that would not really change what you're doing? Because I think if we consider something like that, if we chose to consider an alternative version, I guess I'm curious, is there a different outcome for any of you in particular? Or is it not worth kind of the potential small increase from this body?
Well, we all know the correct answer is the advisory committee makes everything better. So that's an excellent question. Please,
yes,
anyone.
But what would that mean for you doing your daily work if we were to propose an alternative budget, for example?
Yes, please. Anyone wants to respond to that?
The town, go ahead.
Dr. Ilardi, please go ahead.
I was just going to say that our approach for right now will be the same regardless. We will plan on the $285,000 worth of reductions because we would not be able to then go ahead and make those if the revenue doesn't come in as high in the fall, or if it comes in higher. It's easier for us to hold on filling positions, and then if the picture looks better, fill those positions. If we were to prematurely fill those positions now and then we had to make cuts in the fall, the cuts would be more extensive and deeper to the schools because we would then have to cover any unemployment costs that are associated with laying off staff at that time. So we are going to plan our school budget based on the recommended reductions. If you were to approve a higher budget, we would still hold to see what the fall revenue projections look like before we would add anything or fill those additional positions.
Dr.
So
Ilardi,
I guess
would
the
it be
impact is not significant for us. I really can't speak to how it would impact police or fire or whether they're in the same boat as us, but because we work on a calendar year and we have to be prepared and staffed for school in August, we have to take a different approach than other departments may choose to.
Dr. Ilardi, would it be fair to say, however, that even though you wouldn't spend the money, just to kind of play up this line of thinking here correctly, even though you wouldn't spend the money, it would be easier to restore it because it was never taken to begin with, correct?
It may be easier to restore it, yes, because you wouldn't necessarily have to go through a special town meeting.
I'm just trying to capture all the upsides and downsides of whatever action that we take. Are there any other upsides that you can think of? Susan, you're coming next. Jacob's, you're the next question. Any other
That's
upsides?
not what I wanted. Arthur, I didn't, okay. I don't mean to, I'm sorry, I'm not, this is not my question. I just want to, just because of the way Kristen asked her question, I wanted to be clear. I apologize. I'm not trying to jump ahead and I still do want Blythe and Paul to answer their questions. I don't want to have to revisit it because it was misunderstood. My position, just to be clear, my position is not that we would give you this budget and then come to you in the fall and ask you to make cuts if the money doesn't come in. The way, after my meeting with Todd, I did a lot of work on this. And again, just to be clear, I'm not an accountant, but my husband is a CFO and a finance director, and he helped me with this greatly. And he is also working with Todd to see if there's a way that we can refinance things or just some other ways to free up some money that have nothing to do with the budget, but would actually help build up the stabilization and free cash funds. So I want to be clear about that. What I am proposing, or what I am asking for, is to take the 983, take the MEC money off, which leaves around 600,000, take off the retiree health insurance, which gets us to around a $400,000 number. I am not saying that in the fall, if the money isn't there, to go back and ask everybody to make cuts at that point. What I am saying is that deficit of 400,000, should that hold, which in reality, it likely won't, because like Todd said, most towns are not being near as aggressive as we are. We're being significant. We're on the higher end. I shouldn't say we're being aggressive. We're on the higher end and being slightly more conservative in our numbering. So I don't think the number's even going to be 400. But if it were, my vote, we have 1.7 in stabilization and free cash. And my suggestion would be not to go back and ask everybody to make cuts in the fall, but to use the stabilization funds to offset that 400,000, which is not a significant amount to do, and it would not grossly impact our credit rating or our bond rating. And then use the money when it comes back in from FEMA, or if it was related to COVID costs of any of these reductions, or use the money when it does eventually come in from the state, whether that's through the federal government propping up the states, or if the state receipts just end up being more, use that money when it does come in to put back into stabilization and free cash. So I just want to be clear, because I know that Ingrid and Paul are very concerned with, even if we approve a higher budget, it really doesn't help them. And what I'm saying is, it would, if we said we were going to, if the deficit was there, now we're only looking at around a $400,000 deficit. And we would use free cash and stabilization to do that. And I understand that comes with risks. I've spoken with Paul and Ingrid. Todd and Ingrid. Oh my goodness, Todd and Blythe, I apologize. I understand that using free cash and stabilization comes with risks. I just think that the risk of making such a drastic cut to our police and our schools and our town is much greater than the risk that's associated with using our stabilization. The risk associated with using the stabilization is that we go from a AA+ rating to a AA rating. In the end, if we're going to put the money back next year, or we're going to put it back with the state aid that does come in, that is a much easier risk to manage than the cuts that are coming in. So I just want to be clear that I'm not asking for anyone to go back in the fall and make additional cuts. So I would caution the schools of saying that that's what's going to happen, because I'm saying that's not the way that I would make the suggestion.
Okay, I understood. So let's get some feedback based upon that idea, as I understand it, Susan. So that's a very interesting suggestion.
And I do apologize for interrupting, Kristen. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I'm trying to play out the different things we're talking about here, and I'm trying to understand how we would make these decisions.
I'm all about waiting my turn. I felt like it would be a waste of time for everybody to go through that.
You were next. So, and I think part of Kristen's question, and if I could speak for your Kristen, is what action on the advisory committee's part would be helpful or perhaps improve the situation? And if I understand Susan's question, it's if we consider the use of stabilization funds and perhaps free cash, would that provide more of a cushion in either Dr. Alardi's view, perhaps Blythe's view, other people's views, which would allow them to tighten their belts less right now, regardless of whether we give them more money or not, if I'm understanding that accurately. So the use of stabilization funds and such, some comments on that? Ingrid, Blythe?
So let me jump in. To go back to Kristen's question, I would answer that by saying that I want to take the same approach that Ingrid is taking and make reductions now. I think that a different vote would add complexity in several ways. Complexity in terms of, if we're looking to negotiate with unions, I'm only speaking for the town side, it will be probably more fruitful if they understand that there's a united voice going into town meeting about budgeting responsibly a year. And where we differ from schools is we're not bound to a school year and class sizes, so we can probably be a little more flexible in terms of when we make reductions. But I would much rather, forego increases now and perhaps and be able to keep all the people that deliver services than I would to be laying people off later if we have to. With regard to stabilization, I can see both sides of that issue. On one level, it's a rainy day fund, and it sure is raining, so why aren't we going to use it, right? At the second, but balancing that, please remember that it's a one-time source of revenue, and so if we use, say, $200,000 to balance this year's budget, make up for cuts, then we need to spend that money again next year. You need to find another $200,000 and you need to try to put money back in stabilization. It's almost more of a problem than a slight change in your bond rating and what that means to interest rates. So, I caution people very, hard about that, because I actually would say that I would be more concerned about FY22 than FY21. Why do I say that? We don't know how we're going to come out of this recession, and if property values become affected over time, or collections of taxes, do start to become a problem. You're going to see that more pop up in the second year, or projects that might have started and became building permit revenue and eventually taxable growth might dry up, and it gets harder the second year in a recession. I think if you look back through recessions in different places, you'll see that. So I would just want to be very, very careful. I would rather wait till the fall and see if we need to go deeper and think about using it then than thinking about using it now. So that's where the advice I'd give right now.
Ingrid or Paul, would you like to comment on the use of stabilization and free cash and such?
Sure. From KP's perspective, all three. I'm sorry.
I defer to you. Go
ahead, Paul. Paul, go ahead.
So from KP's perspective, again, we rely on all three towns to vote a number, and the conversation that was had last week, it looks like all three towns are supporting the 2.5% increase. So unless the other towns were to find some additional revenue, it looks like we would still be moving forward with that number. My one concern or my one ask is that people would be agreeable to come back and look at things again should we discover in a time for you to vote accordingly that we got walloped with reductions in state aid, because as I said, state aid comes directly to the municipality. And so if we're looking at a 10% cut, that's $830,000 additional dollars on top of the $330 that we're taking by going from a 3.49 to a 2.5. If it's even worse and it's 20%, then double that. I mean, so you can see where that number really becomes problematic for us. Right now, based on the numbers we have, we're prepared to deal with the $330,000 cut that would come across the three districts at this point, and would be prepared to move forward with it.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Ingrid, yes, go ahead.
I was just going to say, certainly, and I don't know enough about the proposal Susan made to speak to it, but if the town were to find other ways to close that shortfall of $600,000, I don't know about the retiree health insurance, but if there were other ways that the town was able to close that so that we had a smaller gap, it certainly would help. At the same time, with regard to stabilization, I would be nervous about using that now. Because as we mentioned, we don't know what our unexpected costs might be as a result of the COVID. So for example, as Paul mentioned with the bus transportation, our bus contract is $500,000. If I have to double the bus fleet, that's a huge cost increase that we do not have budgeted for. And that would be what I would see going back to the town for an additional appropriation. I think that one-time cost would be well served through stabilization funds. We were informed just tonight that FEMA is making some money available, but if KP and the Norfolk schools incur significant costs, as does the town, that $1 million isn't going to cover it. So I'm a little anxious about depleting stabilization, because I do think there's a potential that we may have some significant unexpected costs and have to come back to the town in the fall to address some of those. So that's my only concern.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate everyone speaking to that. We want to make sure all of our options are understood. David, yes, did you have a question?
Just to follow up on Susan's comments, is that the short answer is it's raining pretty hard. We have a rainy day fund. Why don't we look at using it? And I understand what Blythe's saying about 2022, but it's raining now. And if we allow many of these cuts to go forward, we're going to have problems putting any more money into the stabilization fund for years to come. We either propose it as a transfer of funds from the stabilization fund, or we look at doing an override. And I know that's not something anyone wants to talk about, but if we're worried about service delivery for the next 3 or 4 years, an override keeps the money in the budget. The stabilization fund takes it out of a fund that is not being used to support the budget, but is there to support the budget. Bottom line.
Appreciate that, David. Todd, was there some comments that you wanted to add to this issue? Todd Limar?
So as part of my ongoing job responsibilities, I have to have communications with various firms who do credit ratings. And this week we had 2 calls, one with S&P because we have a new bond issue. And then Tuesday I had a call with Moody's, who we've had a previous bond issue, and they wanted to get a feel for where Norfolk is in the grand scheme of things, because obviously, given what's going on, they're concerned about keeping everybody's ratings as is without doing their due diligence to make sure they've checked everything out. So what they do is they look at basically everything, inside, outside, upside, left side, right side, in and out. And they run the numbers and they compare you to all the other towns, and then they want to hear what's going on. So economically, Norfolk again is a little bit exceptional in the fact that we have different types of individuals living here versus other communities. Again, the unemployment factors are taken into consideration. The median income, house values, all those good things. The one thing they also look at is our fund balance. Fund balance is comprised of our free cash as well as our stabilization fund. And with those numbers, they like to have the range anywhere from 5 to 10%, ideally. We're at the low end of 5% right now without doing anything else. That's not to say that's a bad thing, but they did make sure to mention to us that while our rating is there, and as Susan indicated, it is a small step down from AA plus to AA, does impact borrowing costs on a going forward basis. Not a huge amount, but it does impact it a little bit. So we try and do the best we can to keep where we are in a good position so that we keep the cost down for Norfolk on a long-term basis. Having that call, which lasted in the past, most of those calls would take 15 to 20 minutes. These calls each took about an hour. They wanted more information. They wanted more details. They wanted, again, what's Norfolk doing? What is available for us? And we went over all the numbers with them, told them all about FEMA, MEMA, all the budget cuts that we're doing. They wanted to see copies of the budgets. They wanted to see quarterly updates, where we're at with revenues, expenses, blah, blah, blah. I guess my point here is with respect to utilization of those 2 funds now. Yes, it is there as a rainy day fund, but going back and forth, if we hit it now, that brings us to about 4%, maybe a smidge lower. And that brings us out of the range. And while that's only one of the factors, it is a factor. So we have to be mindful of that. And that's why we don't make these decisions lightly. I'm also not realizing the other day until we got the little letter indicating to us that Norfolk is going to have allocated to them about $1 million available. We weren't aware of that before that. So we have to make these decisions a little bit in advance. And, we can make some changes as we go along once we get better information. But I'm still inclined not to necessarily hit that because, again, I don't know what our expenses are going to be. If I had a crystal ball and I could tell you, we wouldn't be here. That's why we're having this discussion. That's why these meetings take so much longer. It's the uncertainty, the not knowing, but the ability to be able to still manage the town in a way that provides the services that are necessary to get by. And yes, we may have to crawl out of this one a little bit. You're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. And that's unfortunately where we're kind of at. But with respect to, Dave Lutz using the funds for a rainy day, absolutely. That's what they're there for. Unfortunately, Select Board has indicated to us they would like to make cuts for expenses purposes. So we have to kind of be mindful of that request. The advisory board, you guys certainly can do what you would like to do. We try and provide information to both organizations, to both boards. And then we as the people on the worker bees have to implement whatever is finally decided at the town meeting. So that's kind of my 2 cents. I'm sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but that's the thought process behind the free cash stabilization and where we're at currently. And like I said, I'm going through with the bonding right now. It's going to save us about 6% overall on the old debt. So, savings are small, but they add up, and more money that we can save doing these various things. And again, looking out the debt overall and seeing if there's other savings, I'm always for it. So that's what we're trying to do best here.
Thank you very much, Todd. We, of course, we appreciate the savings. Kristen, did we get your questions answered? Kristen Baelish?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I didn't hear Todd necessarily say I think I got the sense from most people that spoke that they would prefer that we kind of stick with the 0.13 potentially, and not kind of come up with another proposal. If I'm hearing people correctly, that it's would add more to their plate in a way that wouldn't necessarily be worth the effort. Todd, is that your perspective as well? Or would you, is that your perspective as well? That's my question. Sorry, you can defer and say no comment, but is there
I plead the fifth?
Yeah, you know what I mean.
I do. Before having conversations with both Ingrid, Paul, Larry, trying to figure this all out, I was inclined very much so, like you, Susan, others, we should get the 2.4. The reason being is it's a much reduced budget in years past. It still provides us the ability to provide all services, no cuts, everybody's happy. Again, it's one of the lowest budgets. Other budgets that we were looking at in the communities that were, when we were doing the comparables, they were anywhere from 3.5%, 4.5% increases year over year that we were comparing to. And being at 2.43, with the understanding that if we take the MEC out of that 2.43, we're really at about a 1.54 budget increase. So 1.54% increase all in, it's pretty favorable considering, the fact that we had our retirement increase of almost 7%. Healthcare went up 3.5%. That includes covering all the contractual needs and obligations of the town. So yes, I was inclined to stay the course. The problem is you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. I've already said that probably a couple of times, and sorry for repeating myself. Schools have to plan accordingly. And I'm not saying that it's fun. It's going to be easy whatsoever. But, I think I'd probably prefer to address it earlier, knowing that if we do have revenues that come back, we can reinstate things. More money could possibly go to free cash next year. Also, with respect to free cash, I didn't, and I apologize, I might be diverging a little bit. We have a capital improvement plan. And in that capital improvement plan, we've identified almost $50 million in needs for the town of Norfolk. That's not going to be handled next year, next few years, but we have to plan and put in place. As debt comes off, we have to absorb more debt to cover various things, whether it's a new fire truck, 2 new police cars, radios, a new truck for DPW, new bus for COA, whatever it is that we need to do. Those are all part of the capital improvement plan. And we utilize the free cash for that. So again, using the free cash to cover the budget for one-time revenues to cover ongoing is not a good thing. And we're trying to back off the use of free cash in budgeting purposes. When I first came on, we were looking at about $450,000. That dropped down to 400, then it was 380, 350. Last year was 163. I'm sorry, this year is 163. Next budget that we're proposing has 124. So we're getting down to zero, which is where ideally, when you're putting a budget together, that's what you should have, is not utilize the free cash, because that free cash should be utilized for things of capital nature.
So one upside of having this tight of a budget potentially is that if we do see more revenue, we have flexibility because it becomes free cash versus it being budgeted for more directly.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, a long-winded answer, but that's my 2 cents.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Todd. I believe we have Kristen's questions asked, which I will give one follow-up question to Susan because she was next there. So a follow-up question, Susan, or are you good?
No, when I had unfortunately interrupted Kristen earlier, my hand got lowered. So I actually had questions from that. Okay. But one thing is, this is just a statement. If everyone keeps saying that we're going to restore, I just want to be very clear on this. If you say we're going to restore it, where are you getting that money from? If it's going to come in from state aid, then why not restore the stabilization fund with it instead of giving the schools the added burden of trying to restore something mid-year? If we don't restore it next year, we're already looking at a huge deficit. The schools are starting in a hole, which would mean they would be proposing a 5% budget roughly next year to get themselves back to level for this year and then level for next year as well. And we all know how hard it was this year to get 2.4. I want to make sure everyone understands it's not level service at 2.4. 2.4 was not level service. 2.4 was with significant cuts. It wasn't positions necessarily, but there were lots of things that were originally in the budget that were cut out to bring us down to 2.4. And I guess if we're going to keep saying we're going to restore it, sorry, I had to write things down as I was going, then it's disingenuous to continue to say that if we can't restore it to the stabilization funds, we're not going to be able to restore it to the schools. And that would be my point. My point was never to have our deficit. It was never to use all of the stabilization funds, and it was never to operate a deficit. It was to use that as a floater for a month or 2 or 3 until the cash comes in from the state. So that, I just wanted to clear that up.
Okay, so
and it would also
let's actually get a response to that question. So if I understand you, Susan, it's how about we spend some stabilization, not all, don't shoot the whole wad, spend some stabilization and just restore to that. Does it really matter if we restore to stabilization or just restore to the direct line items themselves? Anybody would like to respond to that as just a strategy? Blythe, Todd, Dr. Alardi, Paul.
If the strategy was to use stabilization past the budget in June, we're going to want to talk to the moderator and town council about that, because pretty sure use of stabilization requires a 2/3 vote. So that might make passing the budget subject to an overall 2/3 vote rather than a simple majority. So I would just want us to think about that.
The procedural aspect. Okay, understood.
Yep.
As a financial strategy, any comments on that? Wisdom thereof?
I would echo what others have said about keeping free cash and stabilization for one-time expenditures, so it doesn't make balancing a future year's budget that much more challenging.
Even if it's temporary, based on what we can see now. Okay,
right. Yeah. Thanks.
Todd, anything you want to add to that? Yes, Todd, go ahead.
So with respect to use of the stabilization fund, yes, the budget, if we were going to include that as a line item, that would have to be, would require a 2/3 vote in order to use those monies, because any monies coming out of the stabilization is 2/3. Monies going into a stabilization would only be a simple majority. Problem is, you can't put monies back into a stabilization until you have certified free cash. So even if we got the revenues in next year, we'd have to wait until after June 30th of next year until they get certified, which they don't really get certified until September of next year. And then those monies that would be free cash certified could then ultimately be voted back into the stabilization fund. So you'd have almost about a year lag from the taking out of the monies from the stabilization before you could put it back in. Couldn't just automatically put it back in.
Oh, interesting, helpful.
I guess, again, just to clarify, I'm not saying use the stabilization funds as a line item. I think there's a lot of confusion here, and maybe I'm not being clear. I'm not saying move forward with a 0.13 budget and then add in 400,000 in stabilization. I'm saying take out the MEC, take out the retiree health insurance, pass a 1.3% budget. If money is short from the state, then you would use it as needed. So, right. I'm not saying put it in it as a line item. So it would still just be a simple majority vote at town meeting. I did have two questions, though. I'm sorry. I want to follow your rules, Arthur, but
well, just Susan, first, just to clarify your last point, I see Todd commenting that no matter how we spend stabilization, it will always require a 2/3 vote. There's no way to spend it otherwise.
In order to move monies out of stabilization, you can only do it at a town meeting. So we'd have to do it at the town meeting for May if we're going to do it. It will require 2/3 vote then. If we don't do it then, we'd have to do it at a fall town meeting to remove the monies out at that point. So,
but you haven't, but I guess I'm confused on this. This is an anticipated shortfall. You haven't actually received a shortfall yet. So why would you pass it in advance of a shortfall? Wouldn't you pass it when you saw there was a shortfall? Because there may not be. I think that's what I'm trying to get at is I know that this is the best guess right now, but I think we're not taking into consideration that every state, all 50 states are going to be affected. We're not talking about a Massachusetts problem. We are talking about a nationwide problem, which means the federal government at some point will have to step in. They cannot allow all 50 states. If this was a Massachusetts sole problem or a New York sole problem, I could understand the federal government not stepping in, but they're going to have to if every state is anticipating these same shortfalls. So I think it's you're planning for something that hasn't happened instead of saying, let's pass it the way it is with the additional cuts that I just suggested, which creates a much smaller number that we're talking about, pass it the way it is. And then in the fall, should the money from the state not have come in, then you can ask to transfer the stabilization and free cash funds at that point.
But I think Todd's point is that after that happens at that point, so don't do it now, but if you decide to do it later, at that later point, you have to go to a town meeting and you have to get a 2/3 vote.
Right, but the town would be in a position of, at that point, there's not, the money from the state isn't there. So the only position we would have is stabilization, free cash, or a tax override. So there wouldn't be an alternative of not doing it. So
Todd, can you please comment on that? Then I want to go to David Lutz because he has a comment.
So Susan, absolutely. You as an advisory board can put together a budget that would include not the reductions in the revenues. And then at the fall town meeting, you can certainly say our revenues are off. We can make that whole in the stabilization. We had to provide something to the select board. Select board requested us. One of the members requested 25% cost reduction, which was a little bit much. So we had to, like I said, go out, find out what was reasonable, put together a budget that the select board wants to present. That's where we're at. Mm-hmm. That's not to say, as you're saying, and I'm completely on board with what you're saying. And like I said earlier, I was of the mindset to go forward with that type of budget, which would be the 2.54 minus the MEC, which works out to be, or 2.43, which minus the MEC works out to be 1.54. And roughly, if we take out that, those are the numbers that you're talking about. So yes, advisory board, take your original budget that we proposed to you before we did the cuts to the select board, minus out the MEC, run with that. That's your proposal, counter to the select board. If there's a shortfall in the revenues, we would have to make that up with a transfer at the fall town meeting from stabilization.
Okay. I did have my.
Actually, just on this direct point, both David Lutz wanted to comment and Dr. Alardi. So I'd like to just finish addressing this point, then get back to you, Susan.
I'll just raise my hand again and come back to me when you're done.
David, go ahead.
So, given the discussion that just occurred, if we're going to ask for 2/3 vote to get money out of the stabilization fund, we should do it as part of the original budget proposal, and we should do it at the June town meeting. If we're not going to do that, I'm requesting through you, Mr. Chairman, that Blythe and Todd bring us the numbers that would indicate what the impact of a override for the money, including the retirees not getting changed and excluding the money, retirees not getting changed, and what impact that would have to the average tax base in Norfolk. Because the other option is an override, and then the money's there next year and the year after. It addresses Blythe's concern about a one-time shortfall falling apart the next year because we don't have the money for next year. So I'd like at least to have the numbers on what an override would. I see your hand, Todd, I'm sorry. Why I'm asking the question.
Which is an excellent question.
I mean, we either do, I think, you know, I appreciate what Susan's trying to do, but given what you're saying, Todd, if we're going to try to do this, we should ask for the money to be transferred from the stabilization fund in June, or we should ask for another source of revenue.
Okay,
we
so
shouldn't
before
push it off because we've heard from both superintendents that they cannot count on the money coming back in the fall, and they would have to make the decisions over the summer. So they need to have undeniable evidence that the money's going to be there on July 1st.
Point taken. Both Dr. Ilardi and Paul Zinni have commented that they need to have a certain level of certainty that they can't count on a 2/3 votes happening at town meeting in the future. Todd, yes, please have the last word on this.
So Dave, to play Monty Hall, behind door number 1, we're going to play stabilization fund. Is that what you're saying?
That's one of the options.
Okay, so door number 1, stabilization, 2/3 vote, town meeting. Again, you can present that as an alternate budget. We, town employees, had to provide a budget for the select board wanted. They have the 983 cut. So those are the two differences. And you can certainly propose this. That's door number 1. Door number 2 is the override. Okay, we asked for an override. Guess what? We have to have a special town meeting. Goes to ballot.
No. Can we vote on if we vote to substitute the budget at the June town meeting? We can't have that. It has to be a special.
It has to go to ballot.
I understand
that's
the ballot,
a general ballot question.
But we can't vote if we voted to substitute something at the town meeting that required an override. It couldn't be voted on at the town meeting.
You can vote for the override at the town meeting. And then we are subject to it.
David, please let Todd answer. Go ahead, Todd. Go ahead.
We can vote it at the town meeting to have the override. That is correct. That is the process. We have to then go to a ballot.
Which would happen in July.
Right, but that's a special election. That we now have to pay another fee.
I understand what I've voted in several of these up and down. I understand how it works.
I can tell you historically, most overrides.
Yes, Todd, please. Go ahead, Todd.
A lot of the overrides that have been.
Yes, Todd, go ahead. Please answer.
A lot of the overrides that have been presented at town meetings have been approved at the town meetings, but they lost at the ballots. So we would probably face that result again. I'm not saying it's 100%, but given what's going on in this economy, I'm not 100% sure that the entire community is on board.
Okay, now David, please. Yes, David.
Well, I mean, the reality is Todd has acknowledged that we are in a different circumstance than most other communities in terms of how people are being impacted by this. A lot of people are able to work at home in Norfolk where they're not able to do that in a lot of other communities. I'm just saying, if we're going to talk about this stuff, it's got to be on the table.
Okay, so
I'd like to hear the data on what an override impact would be.
Okay, understood. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to segment this discussion because the advisory board does need to speak with one another here about what options that we would like to consider. However, part of this meeting tonight is also to get information from the experts that we have with us. I would like to open this up to a couple questions from the public to then talk to Todd, talk to Blythe, talk to Dr. Ilardi and people. So I'd like to just put in a couple questions from the public prior to us going back to the various options that we would like to consider. Susan, is there a procedural question or something?
Yeah, no, please just let me ask this actual question. This has nothing to do with an override. This is information I think we need.
Go ahead.
Before the public speaks. So I'm sorry, this is the original time
Go
when
ahead.
I raised my hand from before.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
not speaking about overrides, nothing about changing the budgets. My question is, it's a two-parter, so I'll ask them both at the same time. What will specifically the cuts to the the police department be, Blythe? I know you and I had spoken about, there was 3 officers who retired, and those 3 officers were originally planned to be replaced and sent through the police academy. And then you and I spoke about that might not happen. So are we going to have an actual physical body deficit at the police department? And then the follow-up question, just so you can answer them at both times, is for Ingrid, Paul, and Blythe, if when you go to your unions and you ask them to renegotiate their contracts and take lower salaries to help offset this, if it gets passed tonight through advisory and if it gets passed at town meeting, this $600,000 shortfall, what are you going to do when they say no? Because I can't imagine everyone, teachers across the board, police, fire, everybody across the board is going to agree. So I guess we're talking about having the solution be everyone takes budget cut or salary cuts, and then there won't be any physical bodies cut. But I think that might be short-sighted. Or do you have information from your unions already that they are willing to do this? That's a two-parter, sorry. And then I'm done with my question.
So I'm not prepared to say right now that the position cuts would come just from police, because that would be significant to their organization. And the overtime cost to cover shifts to be safe, would really impact what we would actually save. We have had preliminary off the record conversations with our town unions, that's police, fire, public works, and clerical. And the early indications are that they are willing to work with us and try to figure something out. So I'm hoping to be able to nail that down in the next week. But what I would say is I would look at open positions. We also presently have 2 in DPW, and a position that we had, we've had a number of retirements and reductions in staff over there. We had budget that we would hope to add 1 person in grounds to just be able to keep up with the workload. I would look at things like that first, and then perhaps reductions in hours in other places of staff to try to keep the core of service delivery in place. So I hope that answers your question.
So you are going to be able to restore those 3 retired police officers, or you don't know yet?
Right now, they're still in the budget. If we can, I think I tried to say this earlier, if we can achieve concessions from all of our unions, we can cover the $205,000 more or less, approximately, without reductions in force. That would be my primary goal. If we have unions who don't want to work with us, then we will have to look at some, some layoffs and perhaps reductions in hours, and we're going to try and do those in a way that keeps service delivery to our residents as even as we can.
Okay. Blythe and Paul, do you have any indication of what you will do if your teacher unions and staffing unions do not agree to salary cuts?
So we in our planning are not counting on salary concessions. We are looking at every other possible source that we can close that gap. We're in the middle of negotiations right now, but we are looking at things like, as I mentioned, because we closed early, we are cutting our summer cleaning expenses. We're cutting hiring. We usually bring in quite a few new staff members over the summer. We're reducing that. We're looking at not filling an administrative team chair position. We are looking at holding on. We have a retiring technology integration specialist, which we're looking at filling until we know what the revenue projections, and that we could add back in the fall. We're looking at the potential with savings from this current school closure at prepaying allowable special education costs for tuition. So we are looking at everything possible to try to close that gap. And we are not counting on a salary concession.
Okay.
We're going to collaborate with the town and other departments, but we are looking at alternative ways to close that gap.
Thank you, Dr. Lottie. Paul, did you have a comment?
I was just going to say, actually, Dr. Lottie said virtually what I was going to say, that at this time, there are a number of different directions that we would be going in to look at closing that gap. But going to the unions at this point is not where I would be going first with this, and that where we would be looking at very similar places to what Dr. Alati was describing. While the positions might be different, we do have some retirement positions that we may be looking to not fill or to hold on filling right now. Like Dr. Alati mentioned, with our buildings closed, there are some savings here or some things that we can be shifting money around to be working on and be addressing the issues in that way. So we're not prepared to be going to the unions at this time to ask that question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so I will open this up to a couple of public questions. Folks have been waiting a long time, and I apologize. The first question here is a phone number. I forget I believe it's the lady's name. This is 508-507-0944.
Yeah, sorry about that. I don't know why it just showed up. Now everyone knows my cell phone number.
Apologies.
I think
what's your name again? I'm sorry.
Jennifer Wynn, Hemlock Lane.
Very good. Okay, I just named you. There you go.
No, thank you very much. No, I think it's because I'm on my iPhone.
Got it.
So I'm speaking as a resident tonight, a parent, and a professional in the field of education. And prior to COVID-19, and obviously what's impacting us now. And I was optimistic to hear Blythe's report that unemployment for Norfolk is 10 more, I believe, than what it was this year at this time, in terms of people accessing. 10 less, sorry, 10 less. Yes. So that's optimistic for me. So basically what I'm asking is, so Blythe answered that. I'm asking for the advisory board. I understand that there are many difficult decisions that need to be made tonight in terms of budget. And I understand where Dr. Alardi and Paul Zinni is coming from. I'm asking that if you do vote for the 2.4% cut, that you would also word in there into the warrant that there's a caveat that this is under the understanding that the money would go towards schools and other department budgets per the percentage deemed by the original budget cuts. And the reason why I say that is at the select board meeting last night, it was brought up by a select person, I believe select person Weeder, that even if monies did come back, that anyone at a town meeting could basically make a motion on the floor to say, well, yes, monies are coming back, and yes, the select board voted to give it to the schools and the police, but we really want to make a motion that it goes to the DPW. So I'm just asking, would the advisory board, if you agreed to the cut, would you also put in there strong wording that it is under the guise that the money would be brought back to the schools and other various departments based upon the percentage, whatever is decided upon, how it was cut by the town?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I'll just chime in quickly before I open this up. I believe that the advisory board, we're good at making recommendations. We can definitely make that recommendation at the time. I do not believe that we can tie our hands in any procedural way. The vote's going to be the vote. It'll go at that time wherever it goes. This may be part of the concern that Susan and others have raised about it. It's not a cakewalk to put money back. It can get complicated, but we can definitely advocate for that for certain. Are there people who'd like to address that from a procedural question? Just us trying to just declare the intention that
yes,
with
yes,
these cuts,
yes,
if they're not necessary, if we wanted them to transfer money back, that it should go where we got it from, as opposed to
correct,
getting redirected on other adventures.
Yes, Arthur, if there could be a strongly worded statement with that so that people understand that that's the intention. I worry for the layperson.
We can very much put that on a recommendation. I mean, we have
yes,
write-ups. That's part of what the advisory.
That's what I was thinking. The write-ups.
Understood.
Yep.
Well, and I believe that whatever our write-up is going to be with respect to the budget, it's going to be one of our longest ever. Is my prediction.
And I do appreciate your time, all of your time. I really do. So thank you
for your patience. Thank you.
Yep.
Anyone else want to address Jennifer's point or question? And I believe Mr. Haddad, Ed, you actually did have a question long ago. I did see your hand go up. I know it's down now, but I wanted to give you the opportunity to ask a question if you still had it, Mr. Haddad.
No, I did have a question, but they were answered by others.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I see no other questions. Anyone in the
Yeah,
public?
Arthur,
Yes,
excuse me,
Susan Jacobson.
I couldn't put my hand up, but there's a question from Dr. Olardi asking, can the advisory board recommend an article voting to utilize up to a certain amount of stabilization funds to offset revenue shortfall without coming back to another town meeting?
Yes, and I was thinking I was probably going to take that offline to find the answer. I'm not sure that we actually know that here, but if folks have thoughts about that. So again, the idea here is, can we put language in a stabilization spending vote that says we're going to utilize up to a certain amount of, so let's say we go up to, just to pick a number, up to $200,000 if there's a shortfall, if I'm understanding your question correctly, Dr. Lardy.
Yes, that was what I was wondering, is if the advisory board could put forward a motion that, consistent with what Susan Klein was suggesting earlier, that if there is a revenue shortfall in the fall, that the town would be able to use up to whatever number you set, $200,000, $300,000 of stabilization funds to offset that prior to going to departments for additional cuts.
And I believe part of the intention there is to give people the confidence now, folks like Dr. Lardy and Paul, who could then make decisions knowing that that would be there. Although I also would like to just throw out the idea that we're 1/3 of the pie here. I mean, other school districts, other towns, I should say, Rentham and Plainville will also have to take actions along these lines for it to, I think, actually have the impact that we want to.
Well, for KP, if the state aid shortfall doesn't come in at, we're estimating about 10% shortfall, they receive their state aid directly. So if it's only 5%, then their state aid will adjust to their revenue. They won't be able to replace the cuts to the budget that were made beyond state aid.
Okay, so Todd, if I could maybe just pick you on the spot here. Can we have a vote on a motion for stabilization fund spending that includes contingent language, like if there's a shortfall, then we spend this?
I don't think you can with the contingency, but I have to confirm with town council.
That's a question we should find the answer to, but thank you for asking it. Any other questions that people have? I've seen, David, yes, go ahead. David, you're muted. Let me unmute you. I cannot unmute you. David, we can't hear you.
I think we'd have to move the money in June. We couldn't contingent it. I mean, I don't understand how we would do that. We'd have to set up like a separate fund within the town budget.
Yeah, I don't understand how. I agree, but let's just ask the question of how something like that could be possible. I've never seen it done. I'm not sure how it would be, but we'll find out. Kristen, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to mention when we think about strategy here, I don't know yet what the meeting in June is going to look like. I don't know if anyone does, right? Like in terms of, will turnout be high? Will it be low? What profile of people will venture out a month from now before schools are even reopened? For example, I just, as we think about kind of potential paths forward and things that might be more complex than normal for an average meeting, potentially, I'm a little worried is not the right word, but I want us to be thoughtful about how this meeting might just be different and how our strategy might not be able to be what we normally might want to do.
Now, Kristen, are you speaking from like a town moderator perspective as to how the meeting could be conducted, or?
I think in terms of if we're asking people to go through some really complex ideas or have more than one, vote on several different budget options, things like that, that would normally be fairly contentious potentially, or go for many, many, many hours. I'm wondering about how, given COVID and how people may or may not feel comfortable being in places for long periods of time in a group, 4 weeks from now. I just, I don't know if I just want to mention it because I think it's worth thinking about, right? If there's any potential, if it changes when we bring up some of these options, or if we bring up options. Well, I'm not saying we shouldn't, but I just think about, most parents I know are not going to go to this even a month from now. You know, I think that I just think it's worth thinking about if this is low turnout, for example, like, do we want this type of decision being done by 30 people? And how, or how do we present it? I don't know if that's true or not. It's just something I've been thinking about. You know, I think even for myself, a month from now, I'm a little bit worried about going, and I have to be there, right? So, just something I've been thinking about.
Okay, well, to your point, I believe it is our tradition to defer most financial items of substance to the fall. Correct, Blythe and Todd?
Yes, I mean, we've got the 2 enterprise fund budgets to vote on, some CPC articles, but yes, there's no capital, revolving funds, pretty basic stuff. The moderator has asked that we keep it as short as we can. And I know he's considering the consent calendar to move, very mundane business quickly. And I count at least 4 articles that we would automatically IP to the fall anyway. So I think Kristen's point is important, because I think trying to get through this in one night with perhaps a different group of people there is something to be considering.
And I think a counterpoint, not a counterpoint to that, but something else to consider is that, of course, schools have to make decisions now. They really can't wait that long. So they're going to adopt a posture in some ways. I don't want to say regardless of what we do, but their decision cycle means they have to do things in a particular order, which might not be as responsive or aligned to what we're thinking in the same order, because they're just operating on a very different calendar. I don't think I explained that the best way, but so I think that I'd like to move, I see no other questions. I'd like the advisory committee to now really consider about how it would like to use its time and talk about options. So what I've heard tonight is many people, and thank you so much to Blythe, Todd, Dr. Ilardi, Paul, for the huge amount of effort that goes into developing these different sort of contingencies and approach. And what we've been presented with, I would call the 2.4% cut. Is that a fair way of stating it? The 2.4 option?
No, it's 2.43% increase, not a cut.
I'm sorry, increase. I'm sorry, increase.
And it wouldn't be 2.4, just for clarification, because the MEC, that was done before the MEC money was taken out. So once the MEC money would taken out, because we all agree that should be, and then there is still the possibility of retiree, it would be 1.5 with the MEC money, and it would be 1.3 if you included MEC and retiree health. If that were to pass from the select board, we could request, I believe it's going to be on their agenda on June 2nd anyway. Kevin can speak to that. I don't know the process for that, obviously. So hypothetically, it would be, we would suggest, if that's the route you wanted, if anyone agrees with me, that we would suggest, instead of a 0.13 budget, we would be asking the town to pass a 1.3 budget. Or conversely, if the select board doesn't vote to exclude the retiree health insurance, it would be a 1.5. And we wouldn't know that until after June 2nd, unfortunately. That would be
I understand. Okay, but Susan, I'm sorry, we now, I'm trying to clarify the options, and I'm trying to narrow, I know we have different possibilities. I'm trying to shape our thinking. So what do we want to call what Blythe and the select board has presented tonight? We're going to call that the 1.3%?
No, 0.13. 0.13%. Yes.
0.13%. Okay.
Yes. And then I would never suggest the 2.4, because that was with not accounting on the MEC money. So I think that's a null and void vote, that's a null and void budget no matter what, because the MEC money is coming. That was something that was done before we knew the MEC money was coming in. So it would now be either, the other options would be a 1.5, which is just current level service that was already agreed upon, minus out the MEC money, or 1.3, which would be current level service minus the MEC money and minus the retiree health insurance benefits, which is not minusing them out, just to be clear. I know we discussed this before in a meeting a long time ago, but it's taking this the state allows us to only pay 50%, paying 65. So it would take it from 65 down to 50. That's
okay,
all.
So we have the 1.3, sorry, the 1.3%. I'll call that the baseline just because that's what we're kind of starting from here. We then have the 1.5%, which is current minus MEC. We have the 1.3 current minus MEC minus retirement. Those are three potential options. Now, are there other options at a very high level that other committee members would like to put on the table as warranting consideration?
Well, Arthur, what are we voting on?
I'm trying to understand what it is that we would like to spend time fleshing out. What's being proposed is we have heard the direction and the budget that the select board is going down the path of. Now, we can recommend for that, or we can recommend an alternative to that. Any alternative that we recommend is going to take a substantial amount of our thinking and time to then go down the path of. And I'd like to understand what options that we would like to flesh out. David, was that an initial thought you had?
I guess the selectmen haven't actually voted on a budget yet, though, right?
Yes, they have.
What did they vote? They voted line items, the whole thing?
No, they don't vote line items.
They voted for, they had the original 2.4 that they passed. They went to their next meeting or 2 or 3 meetings later, whatever it was. It was 2 weeks ago's meeting, and they voted in a $983,000 cut, which took it from 2.4 to 0.13. Blythe was able to adjust that 983 money with the MEC money that was coming in, which was 380. So that took the 983 down to 600, right? So now we're only looking at, they voted in a 983, but she was already able to take that off the top. So it's a 0.13.
Can I jump in for a second?
Yes, please, go ahead.
I hate to make it any more confusing, but I need to remind everybody that we are on track with the MEC, but we are 100% sure that we'll get the piece of paper by July 1st. So although we want to count the whole 380 at some point in the year, I think we need to keep some money in the budget for July. And just in case, so it's not going to exactly be 1.54 to start. The intent would be that for the whole year, but I can't count that now. So I just don't want to lose sight of that.
Thank you. So again, what I'm trying to clarify is I believe that the select board has established a direction, and we have to understand, is that a direction that we feel comfortable with endorsing and supporting, or are we going to develop a different option or options for people to vote on? What's it going to be? We need to spend our time wisely between now and the next town meeting. I believe that Susan has been very articulate about other ideas and proposals that she would like to present. I would like to understand collectively. I don't want us to spend time developing an option that 1 or 2 people vote for. So I'm trying to get a reading, and it's hard not being in the room. You know, do 90% of us cluster around a particular option?
Can I make a suggestion, Arthur?
Yes, go ahead.
Could you, maybe if you, I would love if everybody agreed with me, but that's not the way the world works. And I'm a minority on the board. I'm just one person. So
as are we all.
Right. So my suggestion, if you want to get a baseline, would be, in all honesty, as much as I hate to do it before I feel like I've been able to make my case, though I think everybody understands where I stand. Maybe you want to take a preliminary vote on how people feel. Do people want to pass the select board's cuts, which is the 0.13? And then based on whether you get enough yeses or nos for that, then we can move into what the other options be, and we can discuss those.
I'm so sorry.
Mike, go ahead, Mike.
I have no idea what the options are. I've heard so many iterations of this that I feel very confused. The 0.13% that was passed by the select board is now not 0.13%. Do they have to go back and re-vote now that there may be money?
No, it is still 0.13. It is. Okay, so let me start at the top.
Let's not talk about 1.5 if it's not 1.5.
I agree, Mike. This is why I'm trying to come up with one name to call things. So I'm calling it the 0.13% baseline select board budget. I agree.
Okay,
that's what we're going to call it.
Since I attended all of the select board meetings, not just so I can be able to give this information. I'm not saying that I know everything. I'm just going to give the synopsis to the best of my ability for Michael and for whoever else. So originally, maybe 2 months ago, so originally they asked for a zero-based budget inquiry where they asked everybody to create a budget from zero and move up. So there were already significant cuts, and they came to agree at a 2.4% budget for this year, which was level service, but with cuts, because level service is actually around 3.5.
Yeah, I've been following that. Okay.
That's what everybody agreed on. That passed. They voted it, it passed. 2 weeks ago, because of the hold on, David.
Dave,
we can hear you.
I just muted him. We're good. Please continue.
So Michael and everybody else, 2 weeks ago, they had a meeting. They moved to basically reaffirm the budget. So they took the original 2.4 that they had already passed. They basically cut $1 million from it. That number was $983,000. That took us as a town, as far as the select board recommendation, down from 2.4 to 0.13. So basically a zero budget.
Increase.
Then because that number was 983, Blythe was able to get, if you portion out the MEC money, it's a $600,000 cut to town services, whether you look at it as budgeting cuts or salary cuts or position cuts or just not filling positions. It's taking things out of the budget that they had already had in to get down to that 0.13 from the 2.4.
And they are doing this because of all the evidence that people have been sharing about their concerns about potential revenue shortfalls and such. So they're adopting a somewhat conservative position, which is called a 0.13% budget. And we are trying to understand as a body, are we comfortable with that or are we not?
No one else tonight agrees with me or has another position that they would like to suggest, then our job is to vote of whether or not we will support the 0.13 at town meeting at the end of June. If we do not get enough votes, a majority vote for that, we have to then say to Blythe, please be prepared to come up with an additional budget for town meeting, because we're going to move as an advisory board that this is also an option to be voted on.
An alternative.
Doesn't matter, because the town can vote for either one. They'll be able to vote for the 0.13. They could actually vote for neither of them. They can do whatever they want, but we want Blythe to be prepared. So my suggestion was to take the original 2.4, take out the MEC money, and take out retiree health insurance benefits, which gets us to a 1.3. So that would mean the additional cuts other than MEC and retiree health wouldn't happen. And then we would have to vote at that point, whatever Jay's recommendation is, at town meeting or in the fall to use stabilization funds if and only if the shortfall actually happens. And again, my big thing is I don't like the idea of doing it. I understand a lot of budgeting is planning for the future. I just don't like seeing this significant of a cut made without knowing that we're going to have a shortfall in state aid. If this was a regular recession, I would absolutely agree to make these cuts, because a recession is a recession. But this is a recession that is due to an epidemic, which very well could be offset with federal money. So
the question here is really, how conservative should we be? Does that make sense, Mike? Hang on, I'm going to unmute you.
I'm following. I've been following along. The bouncing ball just got a little bouncy. So.
Well, and that's why I'm really trying to clarify about, we're talking about the baseline, which is conservative to the tune of 0.13%, or should we consider adding some spending back into that in order to make it less conservative and wait longer? Now, this to me boils down to sort of reasoning, risk-taking. We have heard from Blythe, we've heard from Dr. Ilardi, we've heard from Paul about their calculus. And what I'm trying to understand is, to me, they all seem pretty clear that they are comfortable with the 0.13%, knowing that they could put money back, although that's risky too. Do we collectively feel as though we are not comfortable with what they're recommending and we instead would choose to develop something different, like Susan's option, or a different option that no one has had a chance to then bring up. So what options are we going to spend time considering? That's what I'd like to understand.
Yeah, just to interject one more thing, Arthur. I did speak to Jay Tallerman about, someone had raised earlier, they were concerned about moving forward with passing a budget where only 20 or 30 people were showing up.
Mm-hmm.
Jay Tallerman, as the town moderator, reserves the right to cancel town meeting even after it's started if not enough citizens show up. He has the judgment. If we get there and there's 20 people in the room and he says this is too big of a decision to be made by 20 people, he will cancel it. We'll move to a 1/12 budget and he will convene a special town meeting at another date. So I just would like that to be known that he's never, he told me point blank, he would never move forward. He would never allow a town vote like this to happen with only 30 people in the room.
Okay.
Yeah. It'd be nice if he did, because it'd be 10 of them would be us, but yeah, I get it.
Exactly.
Okay.
I would just want to be clear that I don't think that should be part of our fear in passing.
Okay, so I would like to go down the roll here, and I'm trying to get understand from each individual what comfort level that you have with the standing proposal brought to us by Blythe, or do you really feel the need for more information and more options? I always start with, I'm not going to go alphabetical.
Listen.
Going last. You're going last. Okay, so we're going to start with, my glasses here. We're going to start with Kiara Moore. Yes. Where are you at in terms of confidence and your decision making? Kiara, please.
Sure. So I think the 0.13 budget makes a lot of sense. And I think it makes sense to plan for more austerity rather than not. I do, reading the tea leaves, I do expect that there will be federal monies made available, but I suspect that those will be earmarked for specific activities. And so I think that, working that into an anticipated budget is pretty difficult. So I would lean towards approving the 0.13.
Thank you. That's very succinct. And you get 2 votes because I picked on you first. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so
Can't do that.
Mr. Lutz, David, yes, where are you at with this, please?
I asked earlier if I could have some information on the impact of what an override would mean on a per household basis. I'm not totally prepared to say, but I am interested in looking at options that would increase the tax base, which is either moving money, or the revenue base, I should say, either moving money out of stabilization or looking at an override. So, okay,
that's helpful. Thank you. Susan, I believe you have advocated well for the 1.3% position.
No, I have advocated against the 0.13.
Oh, I'm sorry. I would love the 1.3%. Sorry.
I would love more information. I would never speculate that I am, any kind of mathematical genius and on whether or not it's going to be specifically a 1.5 or 1.3. But my vote would be to vote no to the 0.13 reduction, which is a reduction in our level service, and ask that Blythe and Todd come back to us with a number somewhere around 1.5 and how they're going to get to that, whether it's MEC or retiree or only taking 200,000 from stabilization and cutting some more money in other places. That's fine. But around a 1.5, I think it meets us in the middle, meaning we started at 2.4 and then there's 0. 1.5 is kind of in the middle of that. And I think that
I will call that 1.5
is a perfectly logical place, but I'm not going to speculate on how we get to the 1.5. I believe.
Understood. We're just talking about high level options here. Thank you. Jackie Katz, yes. Your confidence with either the initial 0.13, the 1.5, or other options that you would like to see considered, please.
I'm interested in trying to problem solve a way to, so I'm with Susan on this, and I think it'd be interesting to see if we can try and find a way to problem solve or get closer to the 1.5 than the 0.13.
Thank you. Jonathan.
I concur with Jackie and Susan, mostly with David. While I don't personally support looking at an override at this point, I certainly do support more creative use, or at least some use, of the stabilization fund. I certainly agree with the concerns raised that running a funding your budget with the stabilization fund isn't sustainable in the long term, and I can't argue at that point. But I'd also say I don't understand the point of having the rainy day fund if we don't use it when it's raining. So I think this level of cuts without drawing down anything for some cushion from stabilization doesn't make sense. I'd like to see some options of even if we kick the can down the road a little bit to the next fiscal year that we're going to have to address. I would propose we look at least some mitigation out of stabilization funds.
Okay, thank you. Michael Huff, yes, sir.
Yeah, I think I'm with Jonathan in terms of I think that we need to look at more of these options. But it's unclear to me if it should be addressed in the override or in the stabilization fund. I don't know.
Okay.
So I'd like to hear more.
Okay, hear more, thank you. I am next alphabetically or reverse alphabetically. From my perspective, I don't understand why people are not more supportive of what we're hearing from both of of our illustrious school leaders and Blythe. I mean, we're talking about reducing increases. Money can get put back regardless of what we do, especially on the school front. My understanding is unless the other towns match that, we're not really changing anything while adding an incredible amount of complexity in an already uncertain time. But again, I appreciate if the weight of this committee is we really want to do alternate options and that's our due diligence, that's fine. I mean, yes, it might be raining, but I think there's a storm coming. So anyway, that's my perspective. So I am the only one right now with Kiara on that one. Brian, yes, sir.
So I have a couple thoughts. One is if this is actually an anticipated blip in state aid and what would be a one-year event and not a long-term solution, the use of override to permanently change the tax rate for what is potentially a one-year problem doesn't make a lot of sense to me. It would make more sense to use the stabilization fund in that case if we think this is a temporary issue. With what I heard from the schools at least, and maybe the town, is even if we were to pass the 1.5 instead of the 0.13, they would treat it the same because they would be looking to defer cost until later and not have to take additional. So from a pragmatic sense, the difference in the two is actually in the recovery period. And I'm fully sympathetic to the idea is if we go to a basically level 0 budget this year, we will be 2% back. And we heard many times over the course of our budget briefs how long it took to come back from the decreases in the 07, 8, 9 period. So I'm sympathetic to that as well. I think because of those, my leaning would be more to the 0.013 with the stabilization used to bring it up to whatever level we would want it at. If we do believe it's a one-year blip, we should use our stabilization to stabilize during that blip.
So I'm sorry, you're in favor of the 1.3 proposed or the 1.5 modified? Well,
so yeah, that's a good question, and I think it comes down to if we use a stabilization fund, right? If we use if we're using the stabilization fund to stabilize our budget year over year, then I would support the 1.5. If we're not going to support use of stabilization fund, I don't support an override, and I would just put through the austerity measures and count on everyone's goodwill to go to that 5% budget next year, knowing that has about a 0% chance of getting passed. But that's where we should get to.
Okay, thank you. Kristen, the honor of last.
Yes. Yeah, I'm shocked I ended up where I am, but I actually think I am mostly in favor of sticking with the 0.13. I am open to hearing about other solutions and not voting tonight. I think that's where people seem to lean, and I agree with that. I think some more creative solutions can be out there. But I also really take to heart the fact that pretty much everyone that's been close to this work, Blythe and Todd and Dr. Ilardi and Mr. Zinni, they all were pretty clear that they would prefer to stick with this and move forward than try to do something else in the next month. And to me, that is meaningful to kind of defer to the people that are closest to the work and have to put this into practice. So from a philosophical perspective, I would love to get closer to the 1.5. I don't think we should consider an option that changes their retiree health insurance because we ourselves cannot control that. It's the select board, and they've been pretty clear that their appetite is not there. So I think that their option is closer to 1.5, and I would totally want to hear more about that and consider that if that was something we wanted to consider. But right now I feel like I want to defer to the folks closest to the work.
Okay, thank you for that. So that brings us to 3 people who are leaning towards the 0.13 option, and everybody else, 6 of us who would very much like to consider other options. So we are going to be considering other options. Now, it is almost 9:30 at night. It's taken us a while to get here. I do not think it would be constructive for us to spend a lot more time trying to flesh all this out tonight. To me, this would be an excellent subject of an additional meeting. I'm trying to think through from a calendar perspective how much time we're going to need to devote to this, because we're going to have to come up with specific options and ask Blythe and her team for feedback and input on what these are. I'm open to suggestions from a procedural perspective.
Arthur, I think we have to vote on it by next week because we have to have our recommendations for all of the warrant articles in by next week, correct? Or is it 2 more weeks?
Susan Jacobson, can we have a calendar check, please?
So the select board is going to sign the warrant at the at the June 2nd meeting. So yes, actually, you're right, Susan. It's already May 20th, so it is next week.
Okay, so.
And I would like to make one more small comment.
Sure, go ahead.
For Blythe and Todd to be able to do their work, not to debate anything further. My suggestion would be for the 1.5, if what we're going to do is ask Blythe and Todd to come back with what it would look like for a 1.5 budget, is I would not say that even if the schools are making their cuts because from now until September, because they need to see if the money's coming in, and they don't want you to ask them for further cuts should the money not come in and should stabilization not pass. What I would be saying is it's still a win-win, because in my opinion, what's happening is we're not going to cut that additional 600 from the budget. They may not use it. It would still be in their budget for next year. So they wouldn't be climbing, even if they were not able to utilize it in the fall, they wouldn't be climbing out of a hole.
If one other town voted for it.
Right, so that's what
if one other town votes for it.
So that's what I would like Blythe and Todd to take into consideration is, even if you're saying the cuts still need to be made, at least you're not climbing out of a hole next spring when the budget process is starting. You're moving forward from 2.4 or 1.5 versus 0.13. That's
Blythe, do you have comments on that?
Part of my reasoning, whether the money can actually be used in time for schools or not.
Okay, Blythe?
Oh, I understand it. And if they go ahead with the cuts now, then and they didn't need to, then yes, they could. The money would be there, and they could make adjustments later. I did want to weigh in just on one thing, a procedural on an override thought, which is the select board are the only ones who have the authority to put a question on a ballot for an override, which would be required. So I think there would need to be I would suggest there should be some discussion with them about whether, if that's a direction anyone wanted to go, that whether they'd be willing to do it or not, because they alone get to make that choice. So it's kind of a two-step dance, not a one-step.
Right, so procedurally, there's the question. I know override was mentioned as an option by multiple people. What I'm hearing is that the select board is the only entity. Like you can't have a citizen's petition for an override. I don't think it has to be the select board who actually choose to then do that. I would say that while we could make a recommendation, or there's something that we could ask, but I'm not sure how much that should play into our options when it's something that's completely outside of our. David, yes. You're muted, David.
We can put it to them, and if they say no, then we would go to the town meeting and ask for a transfer from the stabilization fund.
Susan Klein, you've attended many select board meetings. My understanding is the current composition of the board would probably be the most hostile to an override that we've seen in recent history.
Again, this is coming not from a personal citizen's point of view, because I've made it very clear when I attend these meetings that I have certain positions that I support as a citizen and others that I am doing my job as a B1 member or an advisory member that are separate from what I would agree as a citizen. So in the nicest way possible, although I would personally as a citizen would support a tax increase in override, and I'm saying this in the nicest way possible. I know you're pretty big on language, Arthur.
Thank you, much appreciated.
There's no chance in hell that the current select board would authorize that. So I think although I agree with you, if we are looking at a full recession, that is something that we would need to consider. But I honestly think agree with Brian on this. This is a blip recession. It's not an actual recession, if I can say that. I know that's probably not the best terminology to use, but this is a recession due to extenuating circumstances that hopefully will go away with certain measures that the government is putting into place, and as well as once a vaccine comes into play. This is not a recession due to a housing bubble. This is not a recession due to the stock market crashing. This is not a recession for those reasons. So I would simply suggest that because of the current makeup of the select board, our only option is to pass the budget to put forth to town meeting the budget that we would like to see, give the citizens both options. If they agree with us, then we just have to have a vote for stabilization funds, but only in the situation where it becomes necessary. I think that's.
I don't think we can do that though. I mean, the money, we have to vote the money in the original budget. We can't, there's no contingency.
We would say to them, we're voting to move this amount from stabilization, but on an as needed basis. I don't think
we can do that.
Procedurally, I don't think now, yeah.
The money's got to be there. It's not there. We can't sort of like say we're going to dole it out. We don't have that authority. Meeting has that authority.
Part of our job is to make sure that, we're exercising due diligence. So I do appreciate the creativity. But just speaking on the override question, just backing up to that specifically,
there's no way it'll pass.
Even if the select board was so inclined, there's no time for that. I'm saying that we have to make a specific budget recommendation, and I don't think that can weigh in. That can't be part of the ingredients in what it is that we're baking currently.
I think our only option is to allow the town to present an alternate option to the town of a 1.5. However, Blythe and Todd come up with that 456 to 600,000 is up to them. We just present them with an alternate percentage of a budget, and then whichever one passes, and that's the extent of our job. I mean, we're all citizens and we can all vote how we see fit, but as far as our job as the advisory is, we're saying we don't support 0.13. We do support, at least the majority did support a 1 point whatever, and that would be left up to Blythe and Todd to tweak their current budget to get to a rough 1.5 number. Both are presented at town meeting, both get voted on, and we just see where the chips fall where they may.
Which brings us to the data question. So I can very much turn this discussion to trying to get Blythe and Todd information that they need regarding what we're calling the 1.5% option. And I would like to use what time we have left tonight. It'd be nice not to go past 10, but takes what it takes. I would like to give them a sense of what they could come back to us with that we need in order to vote next week, because really all that we have is next week. So would people like to speak to alternates, other options other than the 1.5? Again, folks clearly have a desire to explore. I just want to make sure that we're coming up with a concise list of a couple things that we could send away for answers to then come back. Anyone want to comment? other options other than the 1.5 or variations upon that?
Excuse me, Arthur?
Yes. Oh, I see Kevin Calcutt has his hand.
Yeah, I just was going to say Kevin's had his hand up for some time. Thanks.
Apologies. Kevin, yes, sir. We'd love to hear your voice here. And you're muted.
Good evening, everybody. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
So let me start off by apologizing for the decorum tonight. My hair has a new zip code of its own, and it takes about half a tin of pomade to even get it under control. So we're going to go with the hat for everybody's benefit.
Very stylish.
I want to thank everybody for the perspective that you shared tonight. You know, my position has been to relatively stay out of the way and let you work through your process, much like the select board did over the course of the last, what seems like 75 years. And to hear the scope of your conversation and the different perspectives and how that contrasts against the creative ideas you've brought forward is an incredible representation, I think, of the community as a whole. So thank you so much for putting the time and research into constructing these perspectives and presenting them in such an articulate fashion. What was just identified was the potential for the select board to consider an override. And, you know, we've gone to a lot of different places throughout the course of this budget process, going through different percentages, different creative ideas to be able to get us to a number that everybody was comfortable with and satisfying a wide range of perspectives within the community. Now, to get to that point, we've come forward with this budget here. And while, you know, there was a majority vote that pushed this number forward, that is the consensus of the board as a whole. Any additional considerations that the advisory committee comes up with, and in an effort for collaboration, I'm sure the board would be happy to listen to and to consider. However, for an override to be executed at this point in the game would be a difficult thing to accomplish. And I just want to open it up to the bigger picture. We are still in the process of untangling an overspend for the last override vote in relation to the construction of our police station. We are in the process of figuring out how to deliver what was committed in terms of a fire station. And we also have on the horizon an expansion to the Freeman Kennedy School that will likely require something along those lines as well. So I would just caution that we have to take these things into account when we think about using that and leveraging that process as an option to be able to balance what's going to be a negative impact for COVID going into FY21. Further than that, if we look back to the last time that the town experienced financial impact like this, it wasn't in the following year after the 2008 financial crisis that we experienced the worst of that blow. It was the following year after that. And at this point in my conversations with Blythe and with Todd, we're expecting that FY22 could be the harder hit fiscal year than what we're seeing in FY21. So we're not just looking at what's going to be coming in FY21, we're looking at 3 years down the road and trying to accommodate for how we're going to be able to absorb the negative impact past this coming year. So I did want to just say, I do appreciate everything that's been brought up tonight. I think the ideas are great. The course of conversation is fantastic. The select board is open to engage in any collaborative ideas that you feel could bring the best product to the community as a whole. But as it pertains to the override option, we're happy to discuss it, but I do not believe that that fits into the larger picture of things that we're considering at this time. If anybody has any questions about the board's positions or things that we discussed that might have not been brought up yet tonight, I'm happy to answer those, but I did just want to throw that in there. So once again, thank you all very much, and we really appreciate everything you're doing.
Thank you, Kevin. I do see 2 hands up. I really appreciate you sharing that. Jackie, I will go to you first.
Yeah, my question is, I guess, like, I'm still really unclear what the options are. I understand that there's a majority of us that want to proceed with looking to see what the options could be for 1.5, but like, I still don't understand how we can move toward that. And I guess maybe that's what we're teasing out now, but I just didn't understand the options to get there. And it seems like some of those options that we thought were available were being shut down now, which would obviously change, I think, people's position on it. And then my other question was about if we go with the 0.13 now, and then later more funds come in, there's no way for us to guarantee that those funds would go to departments that were most directly impacted.
So speaking to your second question, putting money back in requires votes, and votes are the way that votes go. We can recommend, we can strongly advocate for positions, but it's true. I mean, a vote's a vote. So that's not entirely predictable. Speaking to the first question, about what it is that we're considering. I mean, and again, at a high level, the proposed 0.13% is trying to defer many planned increases, mostly by deferring planned increases, which does result in an overall budget cut. Now, take that hit now, that then would make any future scenarios that are as concerning that people believe they are now or more so, even more painful. So again, this is all a question of how conservative that we want to be from my perspective. Do we want to be conservative to the tune of 0.13%, which Dr. Ilardi and Blythe and oh my goodness,
Paul.
I'm sorry, from KP, I'm totally blanking.
Paul.
Thank you, I'm sorry, Paul. Thank you. Have all spoken to their risk tolerance and how conservative that they want to be. Susan has articulated options for us being less conservative up front. Let's wait and see if certain risks are going to manifest or not in reality, because we don't really know. So this is all a question about how we weigh risk and how conservative that we want to be. Is that helpful at all, Jackie? I mean, are there more specific aspects of the?
No, that's helpful. That's helpful. Thank you.
Are we more conservative now, worrying about not just this year, but concerns next year? I know that other folks have talked about recessions versus blips. So I think a lot of this is how much that we are weighing what the consequences are going to be and over what period of time. And next hand up was actually, there were two hands up. Blythe, I guess. Blythe, go ahead.
So if I can weigh in, of course, I'm going to need to talk with Todd and with Ingrid and with Paul, but my thought is that we would come back to you with close to a 1.5 budget, understanding that it would move a little bit because we need to keep a little bit of money in for the MEC just for the first quarter to make sure. And I can't, none of us can sit here tonight and know that the select board would vote for the change in retiree health or not. Perhaps we would have that on the June 2nd agenda. It wouldn't be until after next week. That's when the next meeting is. So I think I would continue to advocate for what both Ingrid and I have said, which is we would plan to make the reductions. Let's call it the 1.5% budget for now. That passes. We would not spend the money so that in the fall, when we had a clearer picture, and if everything's good, we don't have to change the budget. The money is there. We could restore things however the school and we thought was best to do. And if the cuts are deeper than that, then we can, the town meeting could consider use of override or free cash to balance, to make that up, or the selectmen could call for more cuts then. That's another choice. I think the 1.5% budget would leave money in for KP that if our other two sister towns don't vote for, would be a similar situation that we faced in the past year where we voted a higher one than they did. That would leave money there for us should KP look to have some cuts restored. We would have the money in our budget. But I think for staff, it's just going to be, we're going to want to be better prepared by not, by making reductions, even if you pass a higher amount than we actually need now, so that if it's worse, we are better positioned to deal with it and make less cuts later.
Thank you, Blythe. Something that I'd like just to throw out there for consideration is it's occurring to me, and again, this may just be my way of looking at it. It seems like most of the argument is about what's going to happen in the fall. That's where most of the concern is. It's like, well, we should do these things in case scenario X in the fall happens, or we should do these things in case scenario Y manifests in the fall. I mean, I can appreciate how we want to take steps along our preferred path, but I just want to throw out there a plea that, I would rather, I don't want us to just lightly propose dueling budgets on the floor of town meeting. I mean, I think that I appreciate how making cuts now, tightening belts more now, does create certain constraints. But if we're going to have a budget that we put together that is substantially different than what the select board is offering, wouldn't that be in the fall? I mean, shouldn't we pick our ground as to how much money that we're putting back in and when, as opposed to now, which is just, well, how much slack do we leave ourselves later?
So my response to that would be, it's going to be up to the select board to propose budget adjustments to increase them or decrease them in the fall that you react to. So you are, they make the first move on the chessboard, if you will, to put forth warrant articles and changes that then you consider and then town meeting takes up. So, I've only got a year under my belt here. I'm not sure which is the best approach for Norfolk, in this situation. I just want you to understand what the options are. So they have voted to say they would restore them. So I'm going to believe that that's what they would put on the table to do.
As would I, and that's sort of my point, is that, are we concerned that we, by making cuts that are on the more conservative side now, is our concern that if the worser case scenarios don't manifest, that they're not going to put it back? I mean, Susan, is the concern that it just won't get restored? Is that why we're doing this now? Is because we just lack the confidence that funds are going to get put back in?
So the reason that I am making this suggestion is not because I think that Ingrid or Paul can actually change their hiring or layoffs between now and September, because they have decided, and because I spoke to them, they have decided that they're going to move forward with them regardless. My point is that I don't think that this amount of money is going to end up being a shortfall. As I've clearly stated, I follow national politics very, very closely. And I do think that the federal government is going to have to prop up states, which means the state aid will come in. I also think that the COVID, based on the select board's meeting last night, one of my initial concerns was that making these cuts was going to put them in a worse position for the fall if they had to do remote learning cuts or any additional busing or anything like that. They wouldn't even have the money to do that in. This, now that we know that we're going to get some money back from FEMA, this leaves room in their budget to cover those intended COVID costs until they get replaced. It also allows them that even though they may not be able to restore something in September that they're cutting over the summer, they would be able to restore it at some point in time during the school year, maybe in November, which would lead to things like a technology instructor or a team chair being able to be restored, because those can be restored mid-year. It would also, in addition to that, it's a 4-step thing, it would also stop them from starting at ground zero in the spring. And I think that it needs to be a huge, for those of us who have been on the advisory board for more than a couple of years, have seen the trouble and the will that it takes to get even a level service of 3% passed. I can't imagine the amount of finagling and arguing and begging we would have to do to be able to get level service for next year by restoring what was cut this year and level service for next year. That's going to be above 5%. And we know this town doesn't generally vote in anything above 4%. So I don't really see, I'm hoping that this, even if they can't use it in September, it at least gives them a starting point, because I don't think that it's going to end up happening a year over year where we're ending into a giant recession where we're going to have to make significant cuts every single year. I think this is a one-time thing. So I'm trying to keep them from starting at zero. I'm trying to make sure they have cash available for any kind of remote learning or COVID response that they need until the FEMA money comes in. And also there is the chance that we won't even need to use the stabilization funds at all, because the federal government will prop up state aid.
So those 2 points are what I'm having a hard time understanding. So you keep saying starting at zero. In the fall, we get to say what they're going to start at. So by us making the cuts now, if we decide to then restore money and make them whole as if the cuts never happened, therefore they would not be starting at zero. That could happen in the fall. Or you also keep mentioning that, well, perhaps more federal aid will come. Great, in which case we have more money with which in the fall to then put the money back. Again, it just seems like the alternate scenario of trying to develop something other than the 0.13 seems to be predicated on there's going to be substantial difficulties, us manifesting, putting money back if turns out that we're too conservative. I just don't understand why the concerns about putting money back are so great that we're going to split and have a dual budget. I don't understand that.
Well, I don't think it's that easy to put money back in.
We have a town vote.
Well, we do, but it would be it's a different vote than it is to pass the budget. And it also still, correct me if I'm wrong on this, Blythe, I apologize. I've said millions of times, I don't actually know everything when it comes to budgeting. If we put the money back in, you're only, let's say you're getting a percentage of it back, you're spreading it out across to everyone. If the school was at 1.2 now, are they still going to be at 1.2 as far as level service is? Because what I'm saying is when they do their budget in the spring, will it be based on what their budget was from the summer, or will it be based on what their budget is if we were to add the money back in?
Not sure I'm following.
Okay, so what Arthur is saying, so what I'm saying is by making this cut, we're cutting what their level service is, right? So what we're saying is, so next year when we come and do budget and they say level service is now X, but really level service, it should be adding back in this 2% that we're cutting from them, as well as, or 2 point whatever, as well as their normal, say 2.5 to 3% for level service, which would now mean to get back to where we are now with level service for next year, they would have to vote in between 5 and 6%.
Yeah, I understand where you're going.
What Arthur is saying, if we vote somehow and the money's there in the fall and we don't do it now, we agree to 0.13, but then miraculously we were able to get the money and vote everything back in the fall.
What's the starting point for the future year? Is that
is their baseline now change, or is their baseline still what we vote in now?
Well, their baseline is what they're going to vote in now, because then year over year, but if we
added money in the fall,
they eliminate some people or some services, then yes, to get to what those services used to be, you'd have to spend more money to restore them.
And at that point in time, if the select board, which we don't know, if the select board in the fall looks at that baseline and says, you know what, that's the new baseline, we're not going to really raise it that much after the point, which seems to be the concern. If that happens, then let's have this discussion. This entire discussion seems to be a concern that might happen. Let's wait for it to happen and then respond to it. So I'm saying if at next year's budget, if they decide to, well, we're going to make this baseline now the new baseline because we just want to be fiscally conservative, and if we don't agree with that, then let's have this discussion. Then let's propose a specific budget to put exactly the money back that we want to, not trying to guess now about a conflict that hasn't even happened yet.
Well, I agree with you, but I think that's in essence the same argument that's being made for making the cuts. They're making the cuts based on information that they don't actually have.
Which I think warrants the cuts. And again, this is just my personal opinion, but there is so much uncertainty in the world. So I'm just saying, is there really that much uncertainty about the town vote and the select board compared to the world?
Right. I think that what we're saying is you and I are saying the same thing. We're just coming at it for different points of view. I'm saying don't make the cuts because I don't actually think the money's going to end up being a shortfall. And you're saying make the cuts because we can restore it. So I think
which appears to be the position of everybody.
Right. Our argument is the same. It's just we're coming from the opposite ends.
It is, and I would much rather. I mean, again, the select board is collaborative. I believe that as we are open to whatever suggestions that they have, it works both ways. They are collaborative. I don't take the idea of having dual town budgets lightly. And right now, it's sort of like more question of risk protection, as opposed to the concern seems to be, we don't want to make sure that the school's funding falls unduly. So let's actually ride this out, see how it manifests, and then we can make specific suggestions about the funding should be here or here or here, as opposed to now when you have school leaders saying, they have concerns, they would like to pull back.
I think the problem is going to be that we're not saying, at least from my understanding, We're not saying that this is what people need to do and you have to choose between these two. I don't think the current budget, the zero budget, basically at zero, I don't think that will pass. I think that there are a lot of parents who are upset. I think there are a lot of people who are upset. And I would rationalize to at least be prepared, because I know I, for one, would make a motion to have an alternate budget, which means Blythe is trying to do it on the fly. So even as a non-advisory board member, I would still make that motion at town meeting as a citizen. So, which I spoke to Jay, is entirely possible to do. If as a citizen, regardless of as the advisory board, if I get up and say, hey, everybody, don't vote for this, we can vote in another budget. I spoke to Blythe about it. They have to come up with it on the fly. So it's, in my opinion, it's just better to be prepared. If I'm voted down tonight, and I say me because I'm the one that was pushing it initially, although I'm not, solely the one who agrees.
Very much so. That's true.
Down next week, and the majority of the advisory board wants to move forward with the 0.13. I'm not going to be upset. That's entirely within the realm. I mean, I think our job is to do what we think is best. But as a citizen, I would still not vote for that. And I would, as a citizen, be trying to make sure that all parents are aware of what's happening and make sure that they are attending town meeting. So Understood. If you were to get voted down, if you don't have a majority at town meeting, and we don't always have a significant majority passing things, sometimes it's very slim. If you don't have a majority, then Blythe and Todd are doing it at the meeting.
Understood. Yeah, I think we've established that point. So that's an interesting question. I have two hands that are actually up here. So that prior to us getting into what happens if the budget doesn't pass to town meeting, I see both Brian and Susan have their hands up. And Blythe, did you want to add in a quick comment before I turn it over?
Yeah, I just wanted to try to make one point, which is you've heard staff say that we will probably go forward with putting in place reductions, whichever budget you vote. So I think it would be important, whether it's 0.13 or 1.5, the folks sitting at the meeting, at town meeting, will need to understand that whichever one they choose to vote for, we are going to make the reductions because we think staff thinks it's the responsible thing to do. If you go with a 1.5, then it's I think it becomes a political, what's the best way to address this in Norfolk? If you go with 1.5 and we're, the fall, we didn't need to make them, the money's there to restore it. And to Susan's point, you're staying closer to level service than you were before. You go to 0.13, then you've got to add it back. And, then there's an extra set of, push-ups for select board and then advisory to work through how much are we restoring? How is it getting restored? Select board putting those articles out there, advisory, agreeing or disagreeing. It's a little more complicated. I just want to put that out there.
Okay, there are procedural questions for sure. Brian, yes, sir, please.
So my question goes back to something Todd had said a while ago about looking at boards and where other towns were. My understanding when you said that, other towns are not planning for as big a reduction in state aid as we are. If to Arthur's point, much of this comes down to risk perception, I'd like to understand where that 013 budget sits on the risk scale compared to other towns.
So based on the comparison that we did, which was reaching out to the other communities a few weeks ago. So obviously everything changes on a day-to-day basis. And as we get more information, people make their changes on their budgets. Obviously we got the 4-phase plan of getting back to work and opening up things. And we're seeing how that goes. And every phase requires 3 weeks. And if those metrics aren't met, we're going to extend it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when we did the analysis, at the time we did the analysis, the information, again, half the people were, or 30%, 40% weren't really moving forward or making any changes. The other half were making changes, but more to a probably more or less conservative position than what we ultimately ended up going at. So we took a little bit more of a conservative approach based on a few weeks ago. But if we polled the people now, it'd probably be very much in line with where we're at, given what we've received as far as updates. Again, you know, we're on calls, whether it's MMA, DLS, DOR, there's just so many different calls you get on. Oh, and it's going to be this bad. And then you see the materials that are being generated. State's looking at a $6 billion loss based on tax revenues. Well, that's going to implicate what they're going to be able to give out. You know, some of the things that we normally would kind of bank on, i.e. the prison mitigation, we're taking it completely out. So we have no idea whether it's going to hit or not. So a few weeks ago, we got a bunch of analysis. Great. We took a conservative approach, probably a little more conservative than most others. But if we did that analysis now, we'd pretty much be in line with a majority of the people in them. Other towns, Millis, they're looking at maybe closing a day or two town hall because they're just not going to be able to open up. That's how they're going to balance their budget. Others are laying off, furloughing employees. So again, Norfolk is a little unique in what we have available for us, and it's a good thing, but we're trying to do the responsible thing. Am I aligned with it 100%? No. Yeah. But again, I have to work here, I have to live here, I have to balance all that together. So
yep.
Hope that answers you.
It does. It sounds like our 10%, we were at the leading edge of the movement, but now it seems like is kind of center of bell curve on where expectations sit at this point.
Sounds good to me.
Yep. Cool. Thanks.
Sure.
Other hands. I know we haven't. There's a lot of people we have not heard very much from. Somebody who we haven't heard a lot of. No immediate questions. Susan Jacobson, yes, please.
So can I take off my admin hat here and ask a resident question?
Oh, please. It's 5 minutes of 10. Go for it. It's the witching hour.
It'll be brief. So I think it would be mindful for us. I know I watched the select board meeting where the budget was approved. And I know it was a 2-to-1 vote. We happen to have the select board member chair with us this evening, who was not in favor of the 0.13 budget. And I think maybe it would be helpful to both residents and to the advisory committee if maybe Kevin could speak to, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, Kevin, if I am, then I apologize and you don't have to answer the question, but I think it would be helpful to everyone to understand what Kevin's reservations were and why he did not vote for the 0.13 budget.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
So in spending a lot of time with Todd and with Blythe, we went through some of the competitive analysis that Todd had touched on before. And at that point, we had seen that there was a flurry of municipalities who had opted to wait until the fall to make any adjustment. Now, there are many variables that go into that, whether it be the robust nature of your stabilization, whether it be your ability to tap into a capital improvement budget that you can put projects off for another couple of years, whether it be your dependence on commercial contribution to your tax base, which obviously is getting hit much harder these days. These were all different things that we had to weigh against the results we were getting back from these other towns. But at that time, as Todd said, there was about half of them who had said, we'll be waiting until the fall to make any adjustment. Weighing that against what we had identified as kind of a 3-tiered approach, with the first tier being the adjustment for the MEC, the second tier being the 983 number that we're at today, and the third tier being the doomsday number where things come in much worse and we have to go deeper with our cuts. At that point on, what was that, May 5th, I was in favor of sticking with the tier 1 reaction with backing the MEC out and then waiting until the fall to make any further cuts. Since that time, however, we have had a number of discussions with our content experts in Mr. Zinni and Dr. Ilardi, where they have outlined for us their preference in terms of adjusting and reacting to the proposed cuts. So if we were to take that same vote today, while I would still be very hesitant to go down this road, I would rely on those who would have to manage through this on the front lines and their input before trying to make my own determination on what I feel is best. So on May 5th, yes, I did vote against the motion for the cut of 983. If we were to take that same vote today, I would trust and rely on the input from those within our town and vote to approve that same cut.
Thank you very much. Appreciate you sharing that. Does that answer your question, Susan? Okay, so.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so again, we're at the 10 o'clock mark here. I am trying to understand the guidance that we should best give to Blythe and to Todd and others about numbers to come back with us on. Are people still?
Hey, can I make
Please.
a motion to approve the board that came out of the select at 013?
What's it? Is that what you're looking for, though, Arthur? Or are you looking for something else?
Well, if people want to vote, we can vote. I'm just trying to understand. I'm trying to understand people's appetite for exploring alternatives, and does the 1.5 option that Susan's talked about, does that represent the alternative that we would like to explore, or are there others as well? That's what I'm trying to understand. We need to come back at the next meeting with a very clear sense of options that we are trying to consider, or if we're comfortable with the original 0.13, which originally we were not, only 3 of us were, then so I'm wondering, has anyone's mind changed, or are we still on a path to supporting a alternate budget recommendation at town floor meeting? Now, I know you mentioned, Susan, about, well, what happens if we don't have a separate budget recommendation? Let's just say that enough of us get behind the 0.13, and then that goes down in flames, and that does not pass a town meeting. Now, that to me is actually a separate question. I would first like to just get the sense of, what do we want to recommend? What do we think the best thing to do is under these circumstances?
And that was the purpose of my motion there, Art, was just to see, is that actually where we are? And if so, we can set all those follow-on questions aside. And if it's not, then we can go down that other road. Okay, very well. So is there, so the motion on the table is to approve conceptually the 0.13% budget approach as originally presented by Blythe. Do we have a second?
Second.
So Susan seconds that. Okay, so we have a motion and a second. I will go down the roll, and we will, again, so a vote to approve this means we are good to go with the initial suggestion. If you vote against this, this means you would like to develop alternatives such as the 1.5% or other options. Okay, so this time we will go alphabetically. Kristen Balish, yay or nay?
Nay.
No. Again, this is supporting the original recommendation, nay. Brian?
Yay.
I vote yay. Michael Huff?
Excuse me, Brian, I didn't hear you.
Yay.
That was a yay. I voted yay. Michael Huff?
Huff is yay.
Huff is yay. Jonathan?
No.
No. Jackie? Are you on mute, or is that the sound of deliberation?
Sorry, I was on mute. No. Almost made it a whole meeting not being on mute.
No. Okay. Susan Klein?
Excuse me. Sorry, I didn't hear Jackie either.
That was a no, nay.
Okay, thank you.
Susan Klein?
No.
David Lutz?
No.
Kiara Moore?
Yes.
Okay, so that is 4 votes to support the baseline motion and 5 votes against. So we are in the considering options mode. So thanks for the clarification, Brian. Okay, so we are considering options of an alternate budget to then present at town meeting. Now, would someone like to make a motion to, I
would actually like to make a motion to pass the 1.5% budget. And with the caveat that Blythe has the discretion to come back with us on how she feels best she gets to that percentage. I feel like that's a safe number. It meets in the middle. The way I've done the math is it's basically just taking the MEC money out and then using stabilization funds for the rest. But I would solely leave it up to Blythe and Todd to come up with where they would fall on that. They may be able to make cuts in certain places that wouldn't affect schools and staffing and other things to come to that 1.5 without having to use stabilization funds. And they're welcome to do that as well. I just think that a 1.5 is a much stronger number for the schools.
Okay, so the proposal is to, a vote yes means that we are asking, we're asking Blythe to then develop and come back to our, ideally at our next meeting, a 1.5% budget. I see a question from Larry. Yes, Larry.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so lots of numbers and things going back and forth over the last couple hours. So can someone clarify for me what this motion would mean for the KP budget in terms of the Norfolk?
So I believe we're getting a little chop on your audio connection. Larry is asking, what would the 1.5% budget that we were asking Blythe to develop, what would that impact be on the KP budget? Is that correct, Larry? Yes.
That's correct. Yes,
Blythe,
thank
can
you.
Speak to that?
Without doing math at 10:03 p.m., I would say that it would give Norfolk some flexibility to possibly pass a slightly higher budget for KP, but I can't say how much. I also need to keep reminding everybody that I feel, that's absolutely critical to leave, maybe at least a quarter of the MEC money in the budget, which is round numbers, just under 100,000. So I would still have to go back, to our budgets and ask Ingrid to do the same and think about KP in order to come up with at least that amount to get back to 1.5. And right now our sister communities are planning to make the adjustments we've already talked about for KP. So, again, I'm spitballing at 10 o'clock at night, but I just want everyone to understand that that's what we're going to need to do.
Well, I guess like my basic question is, would this motion give KP an assessment higher than the 2.5% increase that we've been talking about?
It would give us the ability to do similar to the year where the Rentham and Plainville passed a lower budget and we had more money in ours than we could give you. If they still passed 2.5, we would have funds that we could perhaps redistribute, if you will.
Right. Yeah. That's just why I'm asking it, just for the group. So again, remind folks, while we obviously appreciate the sentiment to give us a higher number, you need at least one of the other two towns to do that. And I'm sure you probably know, if you don't, Plainville is asking for a 3-point-something million override, just to provide level service to everyone. But even within that number, it has KP at only the 2.5% increase. So it's actually a slight cut to us. And Rentham has the highest assessment of everybody. So again, I don't want to sound like a broken record between what Paul and Ingrid were saying earlier tonight, but I think from our point of view, we'd take the cuts now. And if more money comes available in the fall and 2 out of the 3 towns approve something, then yeah, we can always find a way. I mean, I guess we'll buy laptops or whatever else. We probably won't hire personnel, but there are other ways to spend it.
Larry.
Thank you, Larry. Yes,
Susan, Larry, I'm sorry. If you, how, just out of curiosity, if you can't or don't want the money now, how would you be able to take it in the fall without Rentham and Plainville? Here's the thing. My point was is that KP is only a portion of this. We have to pass a budget that is suitable for the whole town, meaning the police, the DPW, the fire. you know, the town, the library, the CPC.
Understood. Larry, please finish your response, Larry. Go. Yes,
so I guess to clarify or expand what I'm saying is that we would love to have more money now if 2 out of the 3 towns agree on a number now, but the challenge is if the budgets come up short for either your state aid or our state aid, it's much harder for us to make cuts in October or November than it is now. So we'd rather have a lower number now, and if more money comes available in the fall, fantastic, rather than say, okay, well, here's a budget that's adopted now. However, you may have to make cuts in the fall. That would be very tough for us to.
Understood, Larry. No, and I believe that.
That's why I was asking a question of where this motion would leave us. And again, if so, and like Blythe said last year or the year before, Norfolk voted a higher number, Plainville and Rentham didn't. And so, yeah, the Norfolk vote just, whatever you did with the money is what it is.
Understood. Thank you. There are many hands up here. Todd wanted to get a word in edgewise here. Yes, Todd, please.
So where was I going to go?
I can come back to you.
Hold on one sec. So with respect to I lost. Go ahead. Forget it.
Okay, I'll come back to you. Jonathan, yes, sir. Jonathan Hurwitz.
Yeah, I'm back. Sorry. So
okay, go ahead.
I'd like to make a point of clarification, at least from my perspective, of why I voted no against the 0 point whatever budget. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not in favor of cutting budget to the schools, but I feel like this has turned into a referendum of we're either going to fund the schools or we're not going to fund the schools. That's not why I voted no and why I wanted to look into other options. What I was advocating for is I'd like to hear what possibilities are there to use perhaps some of the free cash or the reserve fund to mitigate some of this. I'm not saying we should use our free cash to solve this problem entirely or to get to level funding. I'm looking at it from a mitigation perspective. Now, I understand and agree the challenges we have with the schools, it's a high bar that we have to cross, right? Because of the way they need to figure out the budgets now for the upcoming year, especially with KP, with other towns in the mix. There may be no ability that we have that's going to give the superintendents we spoke to tonight a comfort level to move forward with anything other than worst case scenario. I don't think it's an all or nothing proposition of either we fund the schools or we go to 013. Because as Susan pointed out, we have other considerations in the town too. And we talked about that 20% of our budget reduction is going to hit the town at large outside of the schools. So what I'm advocating for is fine. If we can't fund the schools because they're not going to use the money, they can't in their budgeting process because the other towns won't agree. Whatever the reason, fine, let's move on. But can we not use some free cash to help mitigate some of that other 20%, the 20% of the 983 that's going to hit the town at large, right? The impact that 20% of the 983 may have on the police, the fire, the library, those kinds of things. Like I haven't heard, I've only heard objections to doing this because of the difficulty that it would pose to the schools with their unique and particular budgeting process. I haven't heard anything for or against. Why can't we use some measure of free cash to help mitigate the impact on other town budgets? I felt like that's been missing in this conversation. And if there's, and that's kind of why I voted no, is I'd like to at least try and understand. I'm not advocating that it's a 0.13 or a 1.5 or anywhere in between, as much as I'd like to say, are there options that we have to use some measure of free cash on hand to help mitigate the impact to other town budgets, even if it's not pragmatic to do it for the schools?
Okay, so I'm now hearing, and thank you for that option. I'll call it a free cash mitigation option. So what we've talked about tonight has been, of course, we started off with the 1.3. We've talked about the 1.5%. Jonathan's bringing up the question of what we're calling the free cash mitigation approach. Blythe, do you have a comment on how you could come back to us with a more freer hand in utilizing free cash to cushion the impact of the cuts and the shock that we're looking to then take here?
So that absolutely can be done. It can be done to, I mean, we're already planning to use 124,000 to balance the 21 budget today. We could, you know, the advisory committee could put it forth as its recommendation, an increase to that, to some higher amount. Just keeping in mind that we do have a couple of shortfalls to cover out of some existing free cash already. We need shortfall legal expenses of two kinds. We have unemployment expenses to cover. So, but that is possible. And if it wasn't,
Evaluation.
Sorry?
And the reevaluation.
Reevaluation, you said.
Thank you. We've got to pay for the reevaluation. Thank you, Todd. We could use free cash now to balance the budget, or we could use it in the fall after it's certified to make up a shortfall. Those are both possible. And I think we've already talked, you know, well enough about whether that's a good idea or not a good idea for various reasons. I want to just make one other point before I lose the thought in terms of ideas to the 1.5. You know, if we assume that our things are going to stay where they are on the KP budget, then the 113,000 we were going to save utilized to make up the what we need to plug in for the MEC and still be at approximately 1.5. That's some quick thought at this point.
So, and again, I want to be clear as to the options that we were asking Blythe to come back and present to us. So is there a sense that you have, Blythe, what you could come back to us with that involves a greater use of free cash? I know you're telling us what some of the trade-offs are. Do you need more guidance from us on specifically how we want to use that? Or is that enough for you to come back with an idea or two that relates to the more generous use of free cash?
I could, but if I know that the two communities are not going to, you know, approve a budget higher for KP, well, I don't want to shortchange KP in any way. If I know that those communities are not going to support that, then those are monies we could reallocate to, you know, getting to 1.5 for the overall budget, and we wouldn't need to touch free cash to do that.
So Arthur,
excuse
me for interrupting, but I'm a little confused because I think that we had a motion, another motion made to, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we had a motion made by Susan to move forward with, I think, a 1.5, but again, I'm not clear. So I just, for my minutes, I want to confirm that. And did we not have a second and we're having discussion now?
Yes, I'm trying to understand what the options are for people to vote on. Like my understanding is that what we want to do is we want to have Blythe come back with one or more options.
Okay, just so my minutes are clear. Thank you.
And I think we're clear on what the 1.5% is, at least I believe that we're clear. Is there anything else? Because again, the number of iterations that we get on this are basically one. So are there other options? Todd, yes, you had a thought.
So I remember what I wanted to say earlier.
Oh, excellent. Yes, please.
So going back to Susan Klein's request to present to you a 1.5% budget, my recommendation would be the original budget at the 2.43 that we presented, we adjust it for the MEC, whether it's one payment or two payments for the MEC, and then adjust it for the KP budget differential to come back based on that information. Because that's kind of the best case scenario. Again, knowing that Plainville and Rentham most likely are not going to go higher, but I could be wrong. I know that last year, Norfolk voted a higher budget for KP anyways, but they couldn't use it because the other two towns didn't vote for the higher amount. So we had to reappropriate those monies elsewhere. Again, we could do that again, but it wouldn't make sense because we know that the other two towns probably aren't going to do it. So why hold off on that reappropriation? Let's do the appropriation correctly wherever it is that we need based on the original 2.43% budget with those couple of modifications, which would bring it down to the 1.5, 1.6, whatever the resulting number is, as a option for the advisory board. That'd be my recommendation. Talking about the free cash, yes, we do have some year-end transfers that we're going to have to do, legal bills, revaluation, things of that sort. Taking those into account, that leaves us only about 350. So we can only use 350 towards the budget this year. Couldn't use more because free cash has to be certified before you utilize it. A lot of times what we try and do is have free cash roll over in subsequent years, which builds up the pot for next year and just helps out with our fund balances and things of that sort on a continuing basis. But that's where we are with the free cash, just so you're aware.
So to Jonathan's point, the option of relying to a greater extent on free cash would be to the tune of $350,000. Okay. Now, so there's two options on the table. Are there any other options that people would like to bring up, consider? I see, there's a bunch of hands up. Brian, yes, sir.
So my question then is, this is a separate discussion than whether or not we would recommend a release from the rainy day fund, which would be a separate motion and require a different 2/3 vote. Is that right?
I disagree.
No,
I think Jonathan's proposal is try to find a solution to mitigate damage to some departments, but with whatever means, whether it's free cash or the rainy day fund. And I think you said the rainy day fund, Jonathan, when you were originally posing this. So whether it's the rainy day fund or whether it's free cash, I can't remember what Arthur called this option, but
free cash and mitigation.
I don't think Jonathan meant just free cash.
Okay.
I don't want to speak for him.
You're correct. I'm talking about whatever we frame it, cash on hand. So reserve funds.
So I'll call it cash
revenue
mitigation.
sources.
Yeah.
I think, Brian, to answer your question, again, my proposal was a percentage, not to delve into the necessarily specifics tonight until Blythe comes back to us, but leaving the discretion up to Blythe. She would be able to speak to the select board, find out how they're going to, what she thinks they're best going to do when they vote on the retiree health benefits. She could use free cash in the budget. She could make cuts in other places, meaning like she could keep the cut for, say, a DPW truck, and the summer, Ingrid could keep in the cuts for the summer staffing at the schools, but it would lower, instead of being a $400,000 loss or a $600,000 loss to them, it might only be a $200,000 loss that they have to spread out over the whole towns and schools. So I think that was my proposal. Obviously I was never suggesting no cuts. Let's just spend all of our money and who cares about budgets. I certainly don't want that to be the impression. I want to just give Blythe the freedom to, as a percentage, to come up with that on her own. I think that for us to necessarily dictate how she should make the cuts, I think we should just give her more flexibility by saying a 1.5, and she should do what she feels is best.
So my question is actually not on the expenditure side, it's on the revenue side, because they have to have revenue projections that match. So that would be my question, is if the 1.5 exceeds current revenue projections, are we also including that there is a release from the fund, which is a 2/3 vote, versus the budget pass, which I think has a simple majority, and that's why I think those can't be linked together procedurally.
I'm not sure I always got the sense that Arthur was trying to get a sense of the committee rather than get down to the nitty gritty, because I don't want to start getting down to the nitty gritty at 20 minutes after 10. I don't have anything in front of me. I don't have my revenue projections. I don't have any of that stuff in front of me, because I didn't think that's what we were going to be doing, was going through, well, there's this much in the stabilization fund and there's this much free cash. And without it in front of me, I appreciate that Todd knew those free cash numbers right off the top of his head, but
Yep.
I thought we were going for a sense of the committee. And the first sense was, do we stick with what the selectmen are going to propose? And now we've got Susan's proposal, or Susan's
approach.
Motion, thank you. getting tired. Motion versus Jonathan's got this other, whatever Arthur called it, the revenue mitigation option or whatever. And, you know, if we decide that we think we want to spend more than 1 or 0.13, which I think we already have, then the options are whether Blythe and Todd can come up with it without going into free cash or stabilization. If they can't, then we're talking about going into free cash and stabilization. And I think it's an and at this point, given what Todd just said about the free cash.
Jonathan, are you interested in combining these options, or to you, are they distinct? In other words, is the use of some free cash and stabilizations fund a strategy to help get us to the 1.5%, or do you see these as separate issues?
You know, from my perspective, I'm sorry if I was using one term interchangeably or mean both. I just would advocate for hearing, like, again, we've heard loud and clear the long-term risks, and it's against best practices to use those types of money. But again, I truly ask the question, genuinely ask if it's on hand for emergencies, and this isn't an emergency, I don't know what is. So I was just genuinely a little bit surprised that our proposed budget didn't have some component to mitigate some of these cuts from there. And I'm not saying, I'm not expecting it to fund the shortfall in its entirety, but 50K, 100K, I mean, something like that. And we've heard loud and clear from the schools the impact it's going to have for them, but we haven't heard the impact that 20% of the 983 might have on fire or police or library. We're kind of being asked to, you know, thumbs up or thumbs down that without actually understanding the cuts that may come from that. So I'm really just trying to understand beyond the, yes, it's not a best practice to use money in that fashion, you know, are we truly dead set against it, and under no circumstances will use any of that money to mitigate some of this gap?
Okay, so I think we have some response. Todd is rubbing his hands together vigorously, so I think he has something to say.
Yeah, so with respect to the impact on the town side, that would work out to approximately 3% of salaries in total, is what the numbers would work out to approximately. We'd have to finagle those numbers. Obviously, that's why we have to have the discussions with the unions to see if we can get some concessions. So that might not impact any potential people per se. Again, we talked about the positions that are open that will probably remain open, but current people pretty much stay intact if we can get those concessions. If we don't get the concessions, then we have to look at potential layoffs. But that's the implication on the town side.
Okay, thank you. I see, Kristen, you have your hand up. Yes, Kristen.
Yeah, I've gotten a few people giving me some ribbing, given they noticed I changed my vote between the 2 times we voted. So I just wanted to quickly.
What pressure being applied?
Gentle ribbing. So I just wanted to quickly say, I think that what was persuasive was Susan's point around the potential for this not passing. And so, you know, I voted the way I did the second time because I do think we need to have an alternate version in our back pocket. Whether or not I vote for that next week, right, is still something I would need to consider. But I think it's important we have, I do think a 1.5 is a good one. I think it's, you know, hopefully it's not too much of a lift for Blythe and Todd, given it's based on some numbers that already exist. So I think that's a fair request in some respect, that some of the work has been done. But I think having an alternate version for us to vote on next week that's why I ended up switching my vote, just to explain, because I think it's important. We should have something else, or if we don't, then maybe someone else brings something from the public, which is fine, but I think we should kind of get ahead of it if we think that's a possibility.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kristen. So yes, Kiara, did you have a question?
Thanks. I feel like we're asking Blythe and Todd to do an enormous amount of work in a very short amount of time for something that we might not even support, just so that they have something in their back pocket. And while I do agree that they should be prepared for town meeting, I don't know that like putting this additional pressure from our advisory committee is what they need to do their due diligence. Just my 2 cents.
Thank you for sharing. I see, Todd, your hand is up again, or is it just left over from last time?
No, it's up.
Okay, go for it.
Yeah, there's no real additional work. Basically, you already have the plan. We just have to make a couple minor changes. It should only take about 7 months or so, but it be no problem.
Okay, I see Blythe throwing things at Todd's direction. I'm just kidding. Yes, Kristen. Oh, your hand was still up. Okay, sorry, I'll lower it. Very good. So in terms of combining this, what I would like to suggest is that Blythe and Todd, can you go back and, using your creativity, consider the best way to get to a 1.5% budget, including the consideration of different forms of cash, whether that's free cash, whether that is the stabilization fund. I say this from the perspective of, we're not giving you guidance of how much to use, but you see the expenses. If there's some combination of free cash or stabilization that would really allow us to have some meaningful mitigation and get to a 1.5%, I'm hearing that many people on the advisory committee would appreciate that being invoked now rather than later when circumstances are more dire, or perhaps that they won't be.
I actually think we can tell you that right now, because if taking out the MEC money got us to 1.54%, and we keep in 1/4 of that, which is $95,000 and some change, we add that back in, and then we back out $113,000 for KP because we assume our sister communities won't pass it at a higher amount, we actually could probably be at slightly less than 1.54%. I haven't been able to ask Todd, with telepathy to do that math yet, but that's generally what we're talking about. And it wouldn't require the use of any free cash or stabilization now. I hope that's clear.
That tracks with the mental math I was doing as we were going over it. If you leave 90 in there for the MEC with the 1/4, and then the 200K for town and for 200K for Norfolk schools, that's a little less than 500K overall add, and that's that's at about that 1.3, 1.4 level.
So I'm understanding the math I believe that you guys are presenting. However, just to make sure the points get addressed, backing up to Jonathan's point. So I'm hearing no sources of cash have any role whatsoever. That seems difficult for me to grasp.
Well, if the original, if 380,000 for the MEC brought us down to 1.54% before, where you seem to want to be, we can achieve, because of the balance, because we assume that our other communities won't be able or aren't willing to fund KP at a higher amount. That takes that off the table. And what it also does is it allows that free cash to roll over to next year and give us a little, even more flexibility in the fall. If then you decide, then the collective wisdom was to use it to make up shortfalls or whatever when we truly know where we stand.
Jonathan, do you have follow-up questions for that?
No, I guess it makes sense to me. I guess if you'll allow it though, Kevin, I guess, again, not to put you on the spot, but was the approach that was just outlined here, was this considered by the select board? And was there a reason why it either wasn't considered to your awareness or it was, but didn't pass muster?
So just touching on the use of free cash and stabilization, it was considered, but I think it was the early consensus of the finance team and the board in general, since our level was at the minimum recommended level by the state, that we wanted to avoid that unless we got into what I had described before as our tier 3 reaction. where there was going to be widespread reduction in workforce. At that point, I think we would have considered utilizing those funds to offset some of that impact. But like I had said before, we are currently working within the tier 1 and tier 2 level of response. So that never kicked into an in-depth conversation. What I would caution as well is, one of the things that was weighing heavily on our minds was if we were to wait until the fall, let's say in this scenario that we've just outlined, our revenue numbers and state aid,
We're holding while Kevin resolves a technical issue here.
AirPod batteries last shorter than our meetings do.
How rude of the technology. Todd, yes, do you want to chime in here briefly?
Yeah, just be mindful on the budget that would include the 1.54 and the changes that Blythe had indicated. That would be at the current revenue levels unaffected.
Understood.
Obviously, we would have to make changes in the fall.
Were those to go down? Understood. And again, Kevin is still adjusting here.
Can you guys hear me again?
Yes, sir. Yes, you're back.
Congratulations, you've exceeded the life of my AirPods more than a select board meeting does.
Yes, achievement unlocked.
The last point I was going to make was if we do wait into the fall and our state aid is cut by our anticipated levels now, we will have lost 4 to 5 months of ability to adjust for those losses and would need to do that in a shorter period of time. I don't think it was ever outlined marginally how much that would increase for the shortened period for the rest of FY21, but it is something to keep in mind that we can't just use the flat values for full FY if we're going to be making the full adjustment come the fall. Thank you.
And
Thank you, Kevin.
And that's what a stabilization fund is for. Sorry.
Well, although I keep hearing that the stabilization fund isn't necessary to get us to 1.5.
Unless what Kevin's scenario that he just described is that we don't get the state aid we expect.
Which is, and let's just focus for a minute on those triggers. So to me, like, we keep asking questions, I believe, about options that involve utilizing emergency funds or some greater creativity. It strikes me that a substantial shortfall in revenue would trigger these things, or layoffs. I mean, we haven't really talked about it, but it strikes me that a lot of the school budget presentations and such were all about trying to prevent layoffs. The 0.13 was all about trying to defer increases, which are definitely impactful of people's lives, but they're trying to prevent layoffs, and that were layoffs to then occur, I think that's something that people would think differently about this, but we can get to preventing layoffs without doing that. And that's kind of a question I guess I have back to you, Susan. I mean, by us trying to go up to 1.5%, we're not preventing layoffs any more than the 0.13%, correct?
Are you asking me?
I am.
Yes. Well, so just like you talked about before, where we were saying, we'll just restore it in the fall if it comes in. It's the same argument. I'm saying it's most likely going to come in, and we're going to be able to replace, and I understand what everybody's saying, because we will have, if it passes, we will have voted to use the stabilization funds, they will come out. If the state aid comes in, we will replace the stabilization. I know it won't happen until June 30th of next year, but we will replace the stabilization funds at that time with that money, because the state aid comes in, you're not spending it because you brought in your stabilization money. It'll just sit there and go to be certified as free cash next year. Should an apocalypse happen, and not only do we get no federal money, but the state cuts are twice the amount that they are right now, no one could have anticipated that. They won't be making any further cuts than they would be doing right now if that were to happen, because we're propping them up. We're not saying don't make the cuts. We're just propping the cuts up with stabilization. They'll still have to make further cuts, even if this, because we're accounting for the money that wouldn't be coming for the state, right? So it wouldn't be going to them and saying, oh, now you have to make a 20% cut. If the money is even shorter than we've anticipated, They're still going to have to make that 10% cut, just like they would have if we had cut their budget now. All this does is give them the ability in September to make their staffing choices the way they were going to make them, to prepare, because that's their job. They have to prepare to the best of their ability, but they have the money in their budget to add in those things that were cut that were not necessarily class teachers.
If another town votes for that, yes.
Right, but which is the same thing. If the apocalypse happens, the apocalypse was going to happen whether we propped this up with stabilization funds or not, and we'd be going back to every single person across the entire budget, the town, the schools, everybody, and saying, sorry, the apocalypse hit, now you have to cut 20%. That, if that's going to happen, that's going to happen. And there's no way to prepare for that. And what we're talking about doing isn't impacting that in any way.
No. But no, I understand that portion. I guess what I'm trying to say is that the 0.13 represents a certain level of conservatism when it comes to being fiscal conservatism, you know? And what I'm hearing is, well, Arthur, we don't have to be that aggressive or now. To me, where's the line? And to me, the line are layoffs. It's just that simple.
Right.
And you're talking about a lot. You're talking about a lot of budget numbers. I'm just trying to say we should be as conservative as we can without laying people off.
Right. So I think
what I'm hearing is that that's too conservative for you.
No, that's not too conservative for me. But my problem is that across the whole budget, town, schools, and everyone, there was no way to accomplish this if we didn't help them prop up with stabilization or free cash, or however they decide to do it. There was no way for them to do this solely across all three levels without some layoffs, whether you want to call them staffing cuts, layoffs, or asking them to reduce their salaries. There was going to be that. There just was.
I guess I'm not following.
What this will do, if we can give them back that 500,000, Paul Denny has said he can't do that because his is tied to two other towns. Okay, but you can now make your staffing cuts the way you were, but now you still have, if you choose to use it, you have the money in here for technology, for whatever you have it for. And Ingrid can make her staffing the way she sees fit without having to cut the team chair, without having to cut the technology teacher. If she doesn't put them in before September, that's fine. She can still add them in. It's adding them in the fall means they wouldn't actually be employed until January, because you'd have to have the town meeting and pass it, and then it would become a resolution. What we're saying is we're going to know by July or August, hopefully, if state aid or federal money is coming in. That should be in enough time that though neither of them can change their teaching staff because they have to make their classrooms, they should be able to continue to employ their support staff, which is still cuts. I know it's not a teacher cut, but it is a cut to our schools. And it will also give Blythe the flexibility to continue staffing the police department without having to make either hourly cuts, salary cuts, or people cuts. And it will, allow the fire department. I know she can't cut staff from the fire department, but she could cut hours. And hopefully this will allow that not to happen.
So Blythe, can you speak to that specifically? Because I think we heard both of the educational directors here said that they wouldn't take advantage of what it is that's on the table here being proposed. But to Susan's point about the town budget itself, could you come back with a 1.5% budget, which would then prevent the specific things that Susan is addressing?
We could, but I'm going to take the same tack that both Paul and Ingrid are doing, which is to be very grateful for the support that you think the budget should be at 1.5 or something close to it, but being very concerned about those reductions and not wanting to be in a much worse situation later of really laying people off. I'm going to continue to work with the unions and try to come to agreement to forego their increases for now, so that ideally, if that 1.5% budget passes, then in the fall, I can restore them. And if it doesn't come in, then nobody is any worse off. And if the cuts from the state are more, then I'm making less layoffs because I will have already saved that money halfway through the year. And we want to be careful about that.
That's why I brought that up, Susan, in the beginning. It's the layoff concept. It just really strikes me that people are trying very hard to avoid layoffs. And what I hear the alternative is well, you can cut it closer than that.
Will it affect your negotiation position if you have a budget and now you have increased budget that you're not spending and still asking people to renegotiate salary?
That is a challenge, Brian. You are absolutely right. On one level, it would be helpful to the schools and I to have a singular voice by the two boards that we're proposing this to town meeting, even though we know what it means. But I think, from my preliminary, off the record conversations with various staff, what I hear is they want to avoid layoffs too, and they'd rather step up and be part of a solution now than have it be much worse later. So that's the approach that we're going to take.
Part of what you could come back to at the next meeting is, because I know we've committed to you guys going back and developing a specific, with like a spreadsheet and stuff, we could go over a 1.5% presentation. I would like to understand if doing 1.5% compared to 1.3 is neutral when it comes to layoffs, makes layoffs more likely, or makes layoffs less likely?
It's likely for us for it to be neutral.
Okay, fair enough.
Again, that if the schools and the town are going to go to, a town meeting, explain to residents that whether they vote for the 0.13 or the 1.5, we're still going to make these reductions. That may be that may cause discussion among residents. But gee, I'm voting for a higher budget, and I'm still going to see these reductions. That may be frustrating for people.
So to the point, I don't want to emphasize a higher layoff risk if there isn't one, and if it's neutral, then, and I think that's Susan's point. So okay, fine. But again, I just don't know how this is going to be received at town floor. Trying to, Susan. So you would be in agreement that there is a very low to no chance of other towns passing this from the education perspective, at least from King Philip. But again, that this would potentially have benefits when it comes to things like police and
well,
DPW.
it also has a benefit. It also has a benefit to Norfolk Public Schools. And unfortunately, we can't pass a budget with specifically what affects KP only in mind.
Right.
I have kids in KP. I also have kids in Norfolk. I also live in this town, and I want the fire department and the police department and the DPW to be staffed appropriately. And I, for one, don't want to have multiple conversations next year on why the streets aren't being plowed and why the roads are in such disrepair, and try to explain to people that, well, we made budget cuts in advance. We ended up not needing them. We'll put it back next year. And then next year it doesn't get voted back in. I'm simply saying I would rather hedge our bets and pass a refined, very, very streamlined budget. I mean, we are talking about 1.5 here. Chad probably has the numbers. I can't remember when our town budget was 1.5% increase. That's significantly less than any of the years since I've lived here that I can recall. It's not like we're willy-nilly spending, in my opinion. I'm simply saying, let's hedge our bets. Let's assume that we're going to get what we need, because this is a nationwide problem, not a Massachusetts problem, right? This wasn't Massachusetts overspending or something like that. This is a nationwide problem. I say we make this, that way we're not making these significant cuts, or it at least helps offset, should the apocalypse happen, the amount of actual layoffs and cuts that would need to be made further, so that we're not in this position in December or January or next April trying to beg the select board and the town to put back the money that was lost and pass a 5 to 6% budget increase. So
I'm just not sure how that gets communicated on town floor. I mean, again, a split budget scenario in my mind is when we have Ingrid, is when we have people saying specific things about they understand the way that the select board voted, but they really believe something else should happen. And that's the horse that I want to back. Right now, we're backing nobody. Everyone disagrees with us. So again, they're going to do what they're going to do regardless of what it is that we're voting. And your point is that, well, but they'll actually have some money left over in the bank account. It's like, well,
which is why, because the 2.4 is already on the budget, is already on the warrant, the town will have both options. If it's split, then Jay can figure out what to do. That's his job as the moderator. It's just, my opinion is our job as advisory is to try to give the town the best option for them and what our support is. And unfortunately we voted, and I know it was very close, but it was 5-4. So we've already voted down the 0.13. Our only option is, the only motion in front of us right now is to the 1.5. So I would just move to vote on that. When the discussion comes next week, if the advisory board or the majority doesn't support the 1.5, then we'll leave only the 2.4 on the floor, and it'll just say without the support of advisory, and the chips will fall where they fall. I'm not trying to convince the board to do what I want. I'm simply speaking my own conscience and saying, this is what, I said. And right now, as of this minute, the majority, though it was slim, agreed that we should put forth the 1.5 or at least explore that option. So I would call for, as I already did, call for the vote on that.
well, we've already agreed that they're going to go forth and bring back the proposal that we're going to vote on next time, I thought.
Well, we did. We voted down the 0.13, but I believe for technical purposes, I made a motion to request a 1.5% budget. So I think that because that motion was done, it has to be agreed. I mean, someone else could say
somebody else actually has to second it.
Okay.
I see your lips moving there, David, but I don't think you're unmuted. You're muted. I can't hear.
Again, the selectmen haven't voted on the warrant yet. How can we be voting ahead of them finalizing the warrant?
We actually, to me, I
thought you were voting on a sense of where the board was, not where we're going to be.
That's correct.
I'm not voting on where we're going to be until we get some of the questions answered.
Yes, I believe that David's correct. I was trying to get a sense of what strategy that people are voting for. That's why Brian made that motion. So again, we are committed to getting the 1.5%. Part of what I'm trying to highlight is how this is going to get presented, and I'm not sure it's going to go down exactly at town meeting the way people think it is, but we can talk about that next time.
We vote on the 1.13 again next time. That's my question, because I think
yes,
I voted against it the second time because I want to see the 1.5, but
that's fine. That's completely fine. Again, I'm trying to get a sense of I preface this by saying, what strategies do we want developed? Brian pointed out, let's just get a vote of confidence that what we have today in the 0.13, and people did not have confidence in that. They wanted more options today. We're going to get more options about the 1.5, which includes the trying to get more protections to the specific items that Susan had brought up as illustrative examples, and potentially free cash or stabilization, but Blythe has said that they don't need that in order to get to the 1.5. So that's what we're going to have presented next time, upon which we can then make further votes. So we have not yet decided what it is that we're going to present, but just to be clear to people, we need to get behind a budget. I know folks have talked about having something in our back pocket. Either the select board goes first in terms of their budget presentation, or if we have an alternative, per Susan's point, that we really feel strongly is different, then absolutely, we will propose that first. There will not be consideration of alternatives. There's just going to be consideration of in that case, theoretically, a 1.5% budget. Do people believe in that or not? So we would preempt, based on Jay's Tollerman's explanation to me, because we make the motion, we would then present that first. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. Let's explore the 1.5, see how people feel about that next week. Do you have enough, Blythe, in terms of stuff to come back to us with? Do you have any other questions, Todd? Does anybody want to add any other wrinkles to what it is that we need to be doing? And I mean that not in a negative sense. I appreciate that folks are passionate about this. This affects a lot of people's lives. So the fact that we're up till 11 o'clock, I understand. Any other options or aspects that people want to be considered here? Okay, now, Susan, we were going to discuss the warrant next. That is not happening tonight. And I am looking for, let's set the next meeting date. So Susan, tomorrow you will have enough time to put in the requisite notice for us to meet next Wednesday, correct? Or do we already have a meeting listed?
No, I'll post it on Friday.
Okay, so and again, the agenda is going to be Blythe and Todd. Will you have the documents that go with this presentation available for us to post by Friday, or will that take longer? If it takes longer, I understand.
We won't be able to get back to you until at least late Monday.
Okay, that's fine. We're asking you guys to then do a lot. I just want to balance that with giving the public some shot at getting a chance to read this earlier than like the night of. So we're asking you to do a lot. The fact that you can do this at all within a week is greatly appreciated. Just let Susan know when you have it, and we'll post it up on the website. Okay, so thanks to everyone for their participation. I will entertain a motion for closure here for us to then terminate the meeting.
Motion to adjourn.
Do we have a second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
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 Anyone
Aye.
opposed? No?
No.
Okay, we'll take that as a voice vote. Oh, come on, Jonathan, did you vote no?
I got nothing else to do.
You devil's advocate. Okay, thanks everybody. We'll see you next week.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Bye.